You couldn't see them, you'd swim and they would stop you, grab you and put the mouthpiece in your mouth. We did that for 4 weeks. At first, it was terrifying. At first, it was the scariest thing ever.
Shooting underwater was also somewhat difficult, with the directors not being directly present with the crew. They were giving orders from outside where they would also monitor the set. Simply put, communication was really key for these scenes.
If you have a good communication between the underwater and the above water station, where the director is, sometimes the DP or all the crew, the rest of the crew, and the electrician and all that, and the underwater. If you have a good communication, it goes more smoothly and you can achieve more and more interesting shots.
Then there's another consideration. Remember in Avatar 2, for that movie, the tanks that the actors were swimming in were basically mocap studios. They were big, empty, unroofed, and thus relatively safe for the actors to traverse. For Alien Resurrection, underwater sets were built. That means that debris was all around. Various obstacles, walls, scrap metal, etc. Added to all of this, the actors were not able to wear scuba gear. They had to wear their own costumes, carry their own props, and that's an environment which, while controlled, was filled with potential dangers and obstacles.
It was complicated by the fact that it was a closed set, meaning we had ceilings overhead. Also, we had quite a number of actors who were not scuba certified. Some were, some weren't. But that also, adds a degree of safety and confusion to what would be happening.
To make matters worse, one of the actors for the film, Winona Ryder, had not been in a body of water since she had almost drowned at the age of 12.
I was about 12 years old and I nearly drowned, and I had to be resuscitated and everything, so I hadn't gone underwater since then. Because I had really short hair, there wasn't a lot of stuff that a double could do because you really see my face. So I realized I was really gonna have to do it.
The pressure to get everything right and everything done safely was on the shoulders of the actors as well as the safety staff. The stars had to take extensive scuba diving sessions and learn how to swim and control themselves underwater. If something happened in the pool, they're in definite danger as they can't just swim up to the surface to take a quick breath.
Basically, it's a lot of sessions. I think we had 10 to 15 water safety sessions before we even got to this tank. Then once we're at this tank, we had about 2.5 weeks of training. And, our dive master, who's a certified instructor, has led everybody through the process of basically scuba diving, but with much less time than your normal scuba diving course.
Swimming through the waters blind while performing for the camera and coordinating to not bump into each other, Alien Resurrection was especially tough on the cast. However, the people that were about to design and animate the xenomorph faced challenges of a far less deadly nature.
They do this every year. Why? Doesn't anyone love me? Isn't there anyone who cares about Sid the Sloth?
Yes, that Blue Sky. Blue Sky had a reputation at the time for being excellent animators and ones that were very influential in the CG sphere, making many advertisements, creating effects for movies, and also eventually being hired for Alien Resurrection.
For the CG, we select Blue Sky Studio in New York because they did this movie called Joe's Apartment.
It featured a lot of cockroaches, and the character animation that they got into some of those cockroaches is what impressed us the most.
In this movie, about 20 CG xenomorph shots were created, and those were predominantly the underwater scenes, which had challenges of their own, especially when it comes to rigging and animation. In a 3D VF interview with Steve Telkowski, he recalls that the alien was modeled in a software called
the Softimage 3D. From sand and sun to fire and rain, the new Softimage particle system gives you full command of real-world effects.
How the models were made is quite unconventional for today's standard. Instead of using polymodels, the artists instead used NURBS modeling. This meant instead of drawing the faces of an object with polygons to create a 3D mesh, you would make use of dozens of control points which manipulate the NURBS curves you are drawing. This modeling method is especially great for precise tasks such as industrial design, but it's also rather advantageous for organic shapes, which the xenomorphs have many of.
I remember it was a pain because they weren't polygons. There was like NURBS-based modeling. We did it in sections. That's how weird it was because the model was so heavy that we couldn't rig it up all as one. So we had to rig up in sections and then kind of piece it together.
This was also a time where inverse kinematic solutions were being introduced into 3D programs, where essentially multiple points of an arm, for instance, can be connected together and influence each other when one joint or bone in the structure is moved. This drastically sped up the animation process.
I wish we didn't have that back in Wavefront. I was doing some beta testing for Kinemation, which would later turn it up in Maya years later. I remember seeing Soft Image at SIGGRAPH, and when that demo where they had the finger and they create a 3-joint skeleton and they put the end effector, and then I was like, what? Yeah, that was where I was like, I want to be working with that.
Before the artists could do their magic, however, a plan was needed in order to figure out what scenes require CG and which didn't. The script was the perfect jumping off point for the artists, as it was specially designed to have a visual focus, with the left side of a page being illustrated with comic panel-like drawings and the right-hand side featuring dialogue.
How many scripts do you know that are constructed with the visuals attached to the actual text?
These scenes were then numbered in order to get an overview of which scenes needed what done and who exactly worked on them. Working with Blue Sky did bring about problems. Not problems in regards to quality of work, but rather problems that have to do with distance and time zones, which required newer methods in order to keep in touch and gather feedback.
There was something called sprint drums at the time, which is archaic now, but it was a way to have a camera on our end and a computer screen where we could see their animations, make comments on them, scroll on right onto the screen.
Another house handled the mechanical environments and structures in the film, working on all of the miniature composites that can be seen in Alien Resurrection.
Jean-Pierre and I, of course, we know very well Dubois, so we are very comfortable with them.
They ended up compositing all the miniature shots with backgrounds and star fields.
And even though the age of digital cameras wasn't quite there yet, in a way, Alien Resurrection's creation resembled a modern production style much closer than what Boss Studios did for Alien 3. A bigger emphasis on digital assets, a decentralized international team which collaborated over the internet, and many more digital fusions between physical and virtual props. There's much more to Alien Resurrection's special effects than digitally creating swimming xenomorphs. We also have a fair share of practical effects, which not only look real, but are absolutely disgusting. And what makes Alien Resurrection so impressive, or maybe its fault, depending on who you ask, from a production standpoint, is that we have a lot of different monster designs that range from various levels of complexity, from intricate makeup work to puppets and animatronics. The prop masters for this film were Amalgamated Dynamics, who are experts in creating special effects of many kinds. They were responsible for gory death scenes, creepy makeup, and even creepier remote-controlled animatronic rigs, which had an impressive range of motion with fully articulable fingers and even a moving tongue. In this early test footage, we can see just how this effect works. The head burster is attached to a string, and the head itself is a remote-controlled animatronic. Further tests became increasingly more disgusting, with the blood color changing to red and the head burster model becoming more and more detailed, with incremental improvements to props. We eventually end up with a surprisingly realistic-looking scene.
So the creature just looks like more of a pulpy kind of a larval stage of a living creature. It's much more alive looking. We've articulated it to a degree that it's very squirmy, it's very alive, and trying to get the most impact. So as it's bursting out of its host, maybe you're seeing something different, but maybe it's just a subconscious thing that you're feeling that it's a very live, living creature.
For animatronic work, we have two big examples to showcase, the newborn hybrid and the alien queen. This time around, animatronics were built to scale, meaning that the newborn animatronic and the queen's head were as big as they would have been in the universe.
There's a sudden, different kind of awareness to it when you first see it, it looks very alien-like, but as it's looking at you, you suddenly realize it's got a whole new dimension to it, something that you haven't seen, and it almost, in many ways, it's what people say makes the alien even scarier because now it has eyes.
Moving the puppets or animatronics around was also rather interesting. A group of people would push the puppet forward, controlling the arms, legs, and torso, and while that is cumbersome, it really paid off in the end. This time around, even the monsters had something to fear. Though this is the part where Joss Whedon would start to separate himself from the film, saying, "I don't remember writing a withered, granny-looking pumpkin head kind of thing makes out with Ripley. I think it's kind of sexy and weird," says Junet. They almost make love. It was very disturbing to American people. You know how they are Puritan. And arguably, the newborn hybrid had it the worst in the end. And it's probably the saddest and most violent passing that can be observed in Alien Resurrection. The creature is sucked out of the vessel from a crack in one of the ship's windows and is torn apart, piece by piece, in the process. Surprisingly, this was mostly done using practical effects work.
Action!
We can again see just how these effects were built from the ground up by observing what Amalgamated Dynamics had done in their test recordings. To make the hybrid model look like it's getting sucked out of the craft, its belly bursts with the guts falling out of the cavity and then promptly being pulled back in. The skin gets pulled into the skull, and finally a different fragmented skull model gets pulled to make it cave in and crumble into itself. Where the CG comes in is when the debris gets flung out into space. Those bony and fleshy bits are done digitally. Alien Resurrection was definitely a saucier film when compared to its predecessors, or rather Fox thought so, especially when it comes to one particular prop. This uncomfortable looking puppet of a Ripley clone is interestingly built. The humanoid form is animated by someone sitting under the table, using levers, with the actor's head poking out of the top, while the body is hidden beneath. What makes this prop and the hybrid newborn model so unpopular with higher-ups at Fox, however, is its depiction of odd hybrid genitalia.
The genitals of the newborn was a whole issue. Jean-Pierre, who is very much adamant that it should have genitals, and that the genitals should look like a cross between male and female. So we came up with something that accomplished that, looked appropriately disgusting. And but at one point he came back to us. The studio was always very uncomfortable with it. And he was sort of, holding them off a little bit.
As a comment from Amalgamated Dynamics reads, yeah, all of our on-set footage showed the penis and vagina since it was there in the build. It was only after shooting that Fox blurred the sweet spots in at least one of the shots. It's kind of strange, right? I mean, in an ultra-violent space adventures that shows everything from heads exploding, dismemberment, and a sentient half-human, half-alien being sucked out of a pinhole into space, they drew the line at oddly shaped fictional lab-grown crown jewels. But oddly enough, even the French director thought it was too much, saying, "Even for a Frenchman, it is too much." Production would wrap up in February 1997. It would release first in France in 1997 and would top the box office there until opening in the US on November 26, 1997. In the US, though, they had another green monster they had to contend with at the box office. As far as the final box office total at $161.4 million, it probably meant that the film broke even. And as the director said, not a disaster, but almost. But others like Roger Ebert would call it one of the worst films of 1997. Regardless of what you think of the film itself, it is usually regarded as a film that stalled the franchise, and it ended with further bickering between the director and Joss Whedon. Joss Whedon was surprised that they followed to his original script fairly closely, but said that with a caveat. It was mostly a matter of doing everything wrong. They said the lines mostly, but they said them all wrong. And they cast it wrong, and they designed it wrong, and they scored it wrong. They did everything wrong that they could possibly do. It wasn't so much that they changed the script, it's that they just executed it in such a ghastly fashion as to render it almost unwatchable. Later on, Junette would comment back at Whedon saying, "I know Joss Whedon said some bad things about me. I don't care. I know if Joss Whedon had made the film himself, it probably would have been a big success. He's very good at making films for American geeks, something for morons, because he's very good at making Marvel films. I hate this kind of movie. It's so silly, so stupid." And it's with this bickering that the franchise seemed to be over and had run out of any creative steam to continue it. Until two former Alien directors, Ridley Scott and James Cameron, started looking into a prequel that would eventually turn into the film Prometheus 15 years later. And you can check that video out right here.
seemingly unbreakable stone wall, there is one drain at the bottom, a single hole that Saruman plans to exploit. The stakes are clearly established, as this conflict will more than likely decide the fate of men, and every decision leading up is based in character. Aragorn wants to call for aid, but Theoden knows no one will arrive, and that they have to fight this themselves. All the while, on the other side of the world, essentially, Elrond and Galadriel speak to each other telepathically, deciding whether or not they can help, or whether or not they will. But that leads to the moment where, in the 11th hour, an army of Lothlorien elves arrives at Helm's Deep, ready to once again fight beside men as they had done all those years ago. It's a moment that's not in the book, and yet it provides this great catharsis in the movie, as it allows the feeling of hopelessness to evaporate a little bit. Reinforcements have arrived, fully trained elven soldiers. Maybe, just maybe, there's a chance. And all leads to the battle itself, as the Uruk-hai army have arrived, chanting before the wall. A move that was actually taken from the stunt people on set. Just to psych themselves up, they started banging their staffs on the ground and banging their chest. The crew loved it so much that it wound up becoming a big rallying cry for the Uruks as the battle was about to begin, creating an immense amount of tension. And with rain beginning to pour over the scene, it all leads to the moment when... the battle begins, and it is one of the greatest battle scenes in film history. That might seem like big praise, but it really all does come together. The effects, the camera work, the music especially plays a great part, as the countless themes developed by Howard Shore over these two movies are used to great effect to show which side is winning at any given moment. That and the geography is crystal clear. We know the layout of Helm's Deep, one long wall and then a big old tower on one side. It helps center us in every moment. We know where all of the characters are at any given time, but what this scene does the best is massive pendulum swings. The power shifts from one side to the other. It's constantly creating tension because it's clear who is winning and when. When the battle starts, the men and elves have the upper hand, firing arrows down at the Uruks. But then the Uruks pull out these ladders and begin to climb up the wall. The power shifts, but the people on the wall are able to hold them back. The power shifts again, but then the Uruks reveal their biggest weapon, as they finally utilize the weakness established earlier, the drain under the wall, and plant a massive explosive inside. And while Legolas tries to take down the Uruk who means to detonate it, the Uruk jumps into the hole and... It's the biggest pendulum shift of the entire battle. The wall has just been burst open, and Uruks are pouring in. You feel the tension shift at every moment. It really becomes this massive roller coaster of ups and downs that makes the entire sequence thrilling from start to finish. From here we have tons and tons of fun character moments, like Aragorn tossing Gimli across a gap in order to slice down some Uruks, and Legolas using a shield to skateboard down a set of stairs, shooting Uruks as he goes. That and the entire scene is backed by a fun rivalry between Gimli and Legolas, as they are constantly counting their kills throughout the entire thing. Not to mention there's a tiny little Peter Jackson cameo where he throws a spear at some Uruks, so that's fun. But there are sobering moments as well, as the Uruks greatly outmatch the men and elves, ultimately resulting in the death of nearly the entire elf force, including their leader Haldir. And following that, the Uruks burst through the gates of Helm's Deep and start pouring inside, forcing the men of Rohan to retreat. It's a massive battle. It spans nearly 40 minutes of the theatrical movie's runtime, and that runtime is also boosted by the times when the movie cuts away, as we see the other two threads all gearing up for their massive climaxes. After conferring with the other Ents, Treebeard reveals that they will not be taking part in this war. Despite everything, Merry and Pippin failed to convince them to step forward. But thanks to quick thinking from Pippin, he redirects Treebeard to a sea of dead trees, all cut down by Saruman, which leads to one of my favorite moments of the trilogy, where even after this long debate about whether or not they would fight, the moment Beard sees all these trees dead, he calls upon the other Ents, who all arrive immediately to lay the hammer down. The music rises into this glorious theme as the Ents march towards Isengard and begin to retake the land that was once rightfully theirs. It's a sequence that is perhaps one of the best representations of some of Tolkien's themes. The natural world is fighting back against industrialization. Ents are destroying all of Saruman's creations, all the while breaking a dam and allowing the burst of water to flood the entire area, destroying everything in one fell swoop. It's a great sequence, and it comes together to form a second climax, on top of the one seen at Helm's Deep, where when all hope seems lost, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Theoden ride out one last time, meeting the Uruks head-on. While it is a heroic moment, it could very well lead to their deaths. That is until Gandalf finally returns, and with him, Éomer, with 2,000 riders of Rohan behind them. It's a huge moment of elation as this massive army of men rushes down this mountain, crashing into the Uruks and taking them down in one big swing. After all of the trials and tribulations of the battle, this moment brings it to a hugely satisfying end. And finally, in Osgiliath, Frodo and encounter with a ring wraith. Frodo nearly puts on the ring, nearly alerting Sauron to his location until Sam heroically stops him. Not only does this show how far Frodo has fallen and how the ring has nearly completely corrupted him, but it also builds to a great scene where Sam gets to show off just how awesome he is, because he gives this final speech that ties all three endings together, and also ties it all in with the theme for this entire story, as the question is posed, why are they still going? What do they have to hold on to?
There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
And with that, despite his previous desires, Faramir lets them go, allowing them and Gollum to journey to Mordor on the final stretch of their quest. The Battle of Helm's Deep ends in success as the Uruks are driven away, and Isengard is successfully retaken, with the Ents in complete control. It's a huge and climactic end to the second chapter, leaving audiences on cloud 9 as it all comes to a close. But despite how satisfying it is, there's still a long road ahead.
The battle for Helm's Deep is over. The battle for Middle-earth is about to begin.
And finally, as Sam and Frodo make their way away from Osgiliath, we see the results of the breach of trust on Gollum, as he and Smeagol plot together to kill the two hobbits and take the ring for themselves, all by taking the hobbits to her. It's a moment that Tolkien fans will no doubt recognize as a clear setup for Shelob's lair. And with that, as Frodo, Sam, and Gollum inch closer to Mordor, we fade out on movie number 2, with Gollum's song performed by Emiliana Torini playing over the credits, selling his treachery that will take us into the final chapter. Much like the first movie, The Two Towers was a smashing success. Reviews nearly across the board praised the movie for all of its best qualities, the visual effects, the performances, as well as the massive scale action scenes. In fact, reviews for The Two Towers might have even been better than the reviews for Fellowship of the Ring. Since people had gotten fully involved in this story by now, their investment with these characters and with this world had only grown, and The Two Towers managed to benefit greatly. And across its box office run, The Two Towers managed to surpass the massive take for the first movie to bring home a whopping $339 million domestically and $939 million worldwide. Lord of the Rings was one of the biggest franchises around, and Peter Jackson had seemingly single-handedly made December the new summer movie season, as people had started to become more excited for what Christmas would bring than what May would bring. The Two Towers continued the goodwill of the trilogy and even continued to wreak havoc over award season early in the year 2003. As when it was time for the Oscars, The Two Towers was nominated for a whopping 6 Academy Awards. While less than the first, it was still a massive achievement, and 2 of these awards would be taken home. Best Sound Editing for Ethan Van Der Rin and Mike Hopkins, and Best Visual Effects for Jim Rigel, Joe Letteri, Randall William Cook, and Alex Funke. While not as big of a turnout as Fellowship, the crew rejoiced in receiving this kind of support from the industry's biggest award show. And with this goodwill, Peter Jackson and the entire crew were hopped up and ready to go, with all hands on deck to bring this massive machine to a close with the third and final chapter, The Return of the King. This time around, to close out the trilogy, Peter Jackson entrusted the editing of Return of the King to Jamie Selkirk, a longtime collaborator, with additional editing done by Annie Collins. But they had a pretty massive task ahead of them. While this movie would have a conclusion, unlike The Two Towers, there were perhaps even more stakes going into this movie than either of the previous ones. Audiences had now become fully invested into this story, into these characters. If the ending dropped the ball, the whole trilogy would come crashing down, and the disappointment would be immeasurable. So Peter Jackson pushed himself and the editors to really bring about the strongest conclusion possible, which was made even more difficult because of all of the elements that were lifted from The Two Towers, such as the sequence in Shelob's lair, as well as the final confrontation with Saruman, which was already proving to be quite a headache to get working. But the machine was underway, post-production was moving swimmingly through the year, and over the spring and early summer months, promotion eventually began for the ultimate conclusion. Fans were antsy, they were raring to go for this final installment. Coming off of The Two Towers, there was nothing more exciting in 2003 than the climactic end of The Lord of the Rings. Audiences were all in, excitement was already reaching a fever pitch, and they hadn't even seen any footage yet. But that all changed as eventually, months after the release of The Two Towers, New Line finally released the first teaser trailer for Return of the King.
Every day Frodo moves closer to Mordor. How do we know Frodo is alive?
What does your heart tell you?
Across a brisk 60 seconds, this teaser provides hints and glimpses to the final stage in these characters' journey. After the two movies we've seen, the pieces are starting to click together. Gollum's want for the ring is stronger than ever, Aragorn gets the sword of the king, and every piece will unite for the battle that will decide the fate of Middle-earth. But that journey will not be an easy one. The harrowing part of this quest will continue to its end, and fans were already on cloud nine. These 60 seconds, while not the most expansive, were enough to tide audiences over. The countdown had now officially begun for December 2003, and all the while, post-production on Return of the King continued at full speed, and during the editing process, like the first two, it was realized that pickups were needed once again to bring this trilogy to a close. So, for another few weeks in a parking lot in Wellington, the entire cast and crew was brought back to Middle-earth one last time. There were tons of sets in this one small place, as several units were filming scenes simultaneously, and Peter Jackson jumped between them day in and day out, all on his trusty bicycle.
Highly sophisticated transport mode. Very, very big budget mechanical device.
Sets were being turned around within the day, as there were so many scenes to film in a short period of time. But what the pickups did allow for was for the cast and crew to return to some scenes filmed at the tail end of principal photography. There were some scenes where they felt like they rushed through them, but now they could spend a bit more time and make them better, make them right. On top of that, across these pickups, there was another scene filmed with Andy Serkis as Gollum. But given the time constraints, there wasn't going to be any way to film Andy Serkis on set, then do motion capture on a stage a few months later. So instead, the crew opted to do both at the exact same time. They were filming the footage and capturing Andy Serkis's motion all in one go, which was a hugely significant advancement in the technology, as it sped the process along by a ton.
So he doesn't have to do mocap on this now? And some other This is the first time in the history of cinema this has ever been... I don't know.
We'll say yes.
We'll say yes.
We'll take credit.
But perhaps the most surprising part of Return of the King pickups was how emotional it all became. This was the last time the cast would all be together, the last time they were filming scenes in this world. What started as simply putting the finishing touches on the final installment wound up becoming a series of emotional goodbyes, as one by one, each cast member filmed their last scenes, with each of them being given gifts, most likely a prop, that they'd all take home as a keepsake from this immense journey. John Rhys Davies in particular got his last Gimli face prosthetic, but this one wasn't actually a keepsake. Because of the fact that the prosthetic was so irritating to wear, it was given to John Rhys Davies so he could burn it. I mean, what other kind of cathartic moment can you ask for? Viggo Mortensen and Bernard Hill were given a big farewell by the stunt team as they all performed a haka, a New Zealand performance often reserved for people of high stature within the community, so it was a gift truly earned by these two actors. Then there was Elijah Wood, whose goodbye was perhaps the longest, as on his final day, on his final shot, Peter Jackson kept doing take after take just to make sure he could get it right. But even after it seemed like they'd nailed it, they kept going. More and more takes. Peter Jackson just didn't want it to end. But eventually, like all good things, it had to end, resulting in one of the most emotional goodbyes for the crew, as Elijah Wood, essentially the main character, had concluded his trip to Middle-earth. And with that, the pickup shooting on Return of the King came to a close. It was an emotional time, as slowly but surely each aspect of the production wound down, and they realized that their time in Middle-earth was coming to an end. But in the months before release, there was still plenty of work to be done by Weta Digital. Over the couple years of making this trilogy, Weta Digital's tools and tricks had massively improved. They'd honed their skills in huge ways over these movies, and it all came together in a massive showcase for Return of the King. Where Fellowship had about 500 visual effects shots, and The Two Towers had 800 visual effects shots, Return of the King blew both of those out of the water with nearly 1,500 visual effects shots. From set extensions, miniature compositing, the continued use of massive to bring these larger-than-life armies to fruition. In fact, the armies this time were so much larger than they had been for the last two. Where The Two Towers had an army of 10,000 Uruk-hai in the Battle of Helm's Deep, Return of the King featured upwards of 200,000 orcs in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. That's a lot of orcs. There were also new creatures this time. Most significantly was the Oliphants, or Mumakills. While they were teased in The Two Towers, their use in battle was put through in full force for Return of the King. That and the Battle of Pelennor Fields was a huge undertaking. It was the biggest, most central set piece of the movie, and the logistics of getting it to work were insane. Because of the scope of the location and the geography of all of the armies, Pelennor Fields wasn't going to be real. It was going to be a massive 3D computer environment, stitched together with live-action photography on the many sets that would bring it all together. The design of Pelennor Fields was helped in large part by Alan Lee, who had the entire area mapped out in his head and was able to help translate it into the digital world, all of which created the most expansive and biggest set piece of the entire trilogy. Then, of course, there was one of the most exciting yet most terrifying sequences for Peter Jackson, the sequence in Shelob's lair. Peter Jackson is arachnophobic. He's deathly afraid of spiders, a fact that was well known within the team for this movie. But instead of shying away from this sequence with the massive spider, Peter Jackson went all in. All of his fears would manifest in this deeply, viscerally terrifying sequence where Frodo comes across this demon spider. The design, the animation, all of it maximized the terror and utilized Peter Jackson's own fear of spiders to really get across this feeling of absolute horror. It wound up being one of the most fun sequences to work on, maybe because of, or in spite of, Peter Jackson's fear of spiders. But even with this mountain of work ahead of the Weta Digital team, what really did it in was that in a quest to make Return of the King as good as it could be, Peter Jackson realized day in and day out that they needed more shots, or that shots needed to be changed. So despite shots being completed every day, the number of shots the team still had to complete was going up, not down. With every day that passed, the workload got bigger. There were more shots coming in every day, including the pickups, ideas Peter Jackson had, and even some connective tissue shots that helped tie scenes together, like a significant moment with Gollum, the reference of which was filmed in Peter Jackson's house with Andy Serkis, because they didn't have any sets anymore and just needed something to base this new performance on. The workload on Weta Digital this time around dwarfed the workload on the first two, but it was all in service of making this the best conclusion it could possibly be. And thankfully, they knew that fans were still reeling with excitement as the months continued. December couldn't come soon enough, and excitement would only skyrocket from here, as on September 23rd, 2003, New Line released the full trailer for Return of the King.
The eye of the enemy is moving. The end has come.
Across another 3 minutes, this trailer does nothing but build and build. It is the darkest hour in Middle-earth. The biggest battle is upon us and the characters, and this chapter will define everyone involved, no matter the outcome. What this trailer focuses on the most, though, is the rise of Aragorn, and how he will fulfill his destiny and take up the sword of the king and lead the people of Middle-earth into a final battle against Mordor. All the while, we pick up on the cliffhanger ending of Two Towers and begin to hint further at Gollum's treachery, all the while showing the evil of Mordor. This journey may take these characters' lives. It will take them to the brink, and audiences couldn't wait to see this entire journey fulfilled. And as the months continued, post-production was in full swing, as all hands were on deck to finish this final installment with one big swing. On the music side of things, Howard Shore continued to develop new themes and new ideas, building off of what was heard in the first two to bring this entire operatic symphony to a close. The major new addition was the theme for Gondor, as it would be the biggest and most significant location in this final chapter. It was a theme that would capture the hope and heroism of men, even when everything else would seem hopeless. And like the first two, an original song was created, this time performed by Annie Lennox. While there was an early version of the song crafted for the end credits, it ultimately didn't feel right. As good as it was, it didn't fit the end of this journey. So a new song was written, inspired in part by young New Zealand filmmaker Cameron Duncan, who was friends with Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh before his untimely passing. This new song, Into the West, was a song written as kind of a farewell to him, as well as in part being a farewell to this universe. It carries a lot of emotional weight, and it was able to give this final outing the bittersweet ending it deserved. Not only that, but the bass melody that backed the chorus of the song was then worked into plenty of moments throughout the movie itself. All moments that dealt with the idea of death and the idea that this is where it was all coming to an end. Then there was a rather integral scene in the middle of the movie that featured a song sung by Pippin, a song that was melancholy. It was rather somber, which played perfectly against this larger-than-life scene. And Billy Boyd actually sang the song, working with lyrics written by Philippa Boyens based on a poem that was in the Fellowship of the Ring book to really accentuate this moment and bring this eeriness to it, ultimately creating one of the best little moments in the movie. All the while, at the same time, the sound design was also ongoing, with tons and tons of new and returning sounds for all of the creatures, effects. It was all coming together in a massive way. And the sound team had a blast creating and recording sounds for the movie. I mean, in order to get the right sound for the trebuchet catapult sequence at Minas Tirith, they dropped a massive brick of concrete onto the ground and recorded the sound it made. Then you had Shelob, who, building off of Peter Jackson's fear, Shelob became this slimy, gross, writhing kind of creature that the sound team had a blast just making the most disgusting and visceral sounds imaginable. Then, on top of that, the sound work also managed to fuel and inspire more of the animation work, which made the entire process incredibly collaborative.
About a week later, all of the Shelob animators trucked over to the sound studio, and we were just blown away.
All the while, audience excitement was reaching a fever pitch, and that excitement was boosted even further on November 18th, 2003, with the second DVD release of The Two Towers. I say second because the theatrical version had already released in August. This DVD, following in the footsteps of Fellowship of the Ring, was the extended edition, with nearly 45 minutes of extra footage. The extended edition of Two Towers adds plenty of little moments with the characters, expanding their harrowing journey, spending a little bit more time with Gollum and how Frodo ultimately tamed him at the start of the story. There's an expansion to Rohan. Specifically, the extended edition sees the funeral for Theoden's son Theodred, further cementing the tragedy of his character. Action sequences were made a bit bigger with extra slashes and slices. Without theatrical ratings to worry about, the action in the extended edition can be just a little bit more violent. Fangorn Forest gets a pretty significant expansion, with the entire forest of trees, not just the Ents, shown to be living and moving creatures, which is exemplified when one tree tries smothering and crushing Merry and Pippin, which also ties back to Old Man Willow from the books. Merry and Pippin themselves get a bit of an expansion, literally in this case, as their time with Treebeard winds up making them grow about 2 inches taller, creating a little bit of a fun rivalry as they continuously argue about their height. But the biggest expansion here no doubt comes from Faramir, who, after meeting him, we get a massive flashback with him and his brother Boromir in the city of Osgiliath. We get to see this dynamic firsthand, we get to see these two brothers interact, and in a direct tie-in to Return of the King, we get a pretty significant taste of Howard Shore's heroic theme for Gondor. And in another tie-in to Return of the King, we meet Denethor, Boromir and Faramir's father, who loves Boromir and kinda hates Faramir. The scene establishes their dynamic and also carries a little bit of tragedy, as this would be the last time they would all speak to each other, as the scene ends with Boromir rushing off to Rivendell to become part of the Fellowship. The scene also greatly helps Faramir's character, as his decision to take the ring to Gondor is further motivated by his quest to try and win his father's favor. It's good stuff and cements why these extended editions are so beloved, because they really do expand and explore these characters. And while The Two Towers ultimately ends the same way, there is a lot more resolution this time. We see Merry and Pippin find Longbottom Leaf and Isengard, we see Frodo and Sam leave Osgiliath, all the while informing Faramir of their exact path, which helps give a sense of dread for the third chapter, as Faramir suspects that Gollum is up to something. As the Uruks are stormed away from Helm's Deep, we see the trees of Fangorn swallow them and kill them, bringing that sequence to a pretty clean-cut conclusion. And of course, there's a payoff to the rivalry between Legolas and Gimli, as they finally tally up their kills. While the extended edition is significantly longer, it helps expand on the story in great ways, all the while, again, allowing people to spend just that much more time in this universe and with these characters. And the lead-ins to Return of the King only boosted excitement, as audiences were counting the days in the last months of the year. So was the crew behind the scenes, as the final stretch to finish the movie was a massive undertaking.
Normally in post-production, you edit the film, lock your picture, and you do the visual effects, and then you'll score the film. Then you start your final mix.
But we're not talking normal here.
Yeah.
Every single aspect of post-production was working around the clock. New visual effects shots were coming day by day. In fact, in the last 2 months of visual effects for Return of the King, Weta Digital had more shots to complete than the entirety of Fellowship and Two Towers combined. These weren't small shots either, they were massive, with plenty of artists saying that the work done on Fellowship was child's play compared to what they were doing on Return of the King. Music was being finalized until the last minute, the sound design and mix was all happening right down to the wire, as was the editing process, which included one of the biggest editing headaches: the final confrontation with Saruman, as inherited from the Two Towers. But even with it playing at the start of Return of the King, it became harder and harder to really get it to sell as the beginning of this movie. So the drastic and immensely difficult decision was made to cut it from the movie. It was a move that greatly angered Christopher Lee, news of which was inevitably made public, revealing to audiences that this scene would ultimately not make it into the movie. It wasn't a great way to end the working relationship with Peter Jackson and Christopher Lee, which is unfortunate. But either way, the scene was ultimately cut from the movie, all in an attempt to streamline the opening of the movie and get into the story of Return of the King as fast as possible. As post-production continued, meetings were held with all of the department heads as the clock wound down closer and closer until delivery. The post was so incredibly down to the wire that they, in fact, passed the wire. The delivery was initially set for the end of October 2003, but the mixing continued right into November. Picture wasn't locked until about November 12th, music wasn't done until about November 15th, and it was one of the rare occasions where the final sound mix was done before the visual effects were all completed. But finally, after many sleepless nights and a full 48-hour process to get the last shot through the door, it was finally done. Return of the King was finally finished, with mere days left before the world premiere. The movie was delivered, all of the reels were sent off, and every person involved in the post-production process breathed a heavy sigh of relief. After all of these years, the Lord of the Rings trilogy had just been completed.
You know, it's important to have experiences, and at least this has been a good experience in how to deliver a film at the last minute. You know, so we all know how to do it now. Should it ever come in handy again in the future?
And as promised a year before during the premiere cycle for The Two Towers, the world premiere for Return of the King was in fact held in Wellington, New Zealand. And once again, Weta Workshop dressed the Embassy Theatre with another massive sculpture, this time of a fell beast overlooking the area. They really do knock it out of the park every time. Middle-earth had come home for one final installment. The entire cast, plenty of the crew, they were all there with fans in a massive celebration of both this film and its impact on New Zealand as a whole. There was a massive parade with each of the cast and crew carted through the entire city. The whole city was dressed with posters and memorabilia. Up to 150,000 people turned up to experience the premiere, to be there for this massive moment. And as the month of December continued, following premieres were held across the world as audiences were slowly but surely getting sucked into this final chapter. The premiere in Oslo, Norway even included a massive stage reenactment of the events of the first two movies before the third one started, all orchestrated and planned over about 6 months. It was huge. The days were ticking by as excitement went beyond the fever pitch and instead skyrocketed to levels never seen before. Lord of the Rings was the film event of the year. The conclusion of this journey was the most exciting thing that audiences could ask for. The stakes were still off the charts. You know, this third chapter really had to stick the landing, but the goodwill coming off the first two left audiences with nothing but excitement going into Return of the King, and it all finally led to December 17th, 2003, where after a massive 8-year journey, after the first two chapters had swept over the world with critical acclaim, the end had now arrived. It was now time to jump over to theaters one last time for the final visit to Middle-earth. This movie opens in a rather peculiar way, with a flashback to Smeagol some 500 years ago. It might seem like an inconsequential scene at first, but that feeling suddenly evaporates once he and his friend Deagle discover the One Ring. In a scene expertly directed by Fran Walsh, the ring immediately ensnares Smeagol, turning the two friends against each other, resulting in Smeagol, without any hesitation really, killing Deagle. And as such, we flash over the next few hundred years as Smeagol slowly withers down and mutates into the Gollum we all recognize. It's a haunting scene, a pulse-pounding and unexpected way to open the movie, but it squarely recenters focus back on the One Ring and its power to corrupt virtually everyone. And with that, we flash back to Frodo and Sam, who follow Gollum closer and closer to Mordor as we enter the third and final leg of this massive journey. Which leaves the most daunting question for audiences worldwide. Is this finale any good? Thankfully, it's absolutely fantastic. Return of the King sticks the landing in more ways than one. The story is huge, the characters are all brought to satisfying places, and the harrowing journey comes to a close in a massive climactic showcase of visual effects, action, and the biggest emotional wallop the trilogy has to offer. From minute one, audiences were right back into this world, strapped in for their final adventure, as they began to watch as the first half of this movie elaborately sets the stage for the grand finale. Each character moves around the board, being put in just the right spot for the action that's set to ensue. Frodo and Sam inch closer and closer to Mordor, with Gollum sowing seeds of deceit in Frodo's mind, turning him against Sam, which ultimately builds into a big turning point, as Frodo and Gollum wind up leaving Sam behind, further cementing Gollum's treachery. Gandalf and Pippin have journeyed to the realm of Gondor, specifically the massively impressive city of Minas Tirith. I mean, look at this place. Look at how cool it looks. Here they meet the steward of Gondor, Denethor, who's all but lost his mind thanks to the discovery that his son Boromir is dead. And that madness continues throughout this side of the story, as he willingly sends his other son Faramir to Osgiliath, ultimately to die. Then he freaks out when Faramir comes back seemingly dead. Man's really lost it, let me tell you. But Minas Tirith is under threat. Orcs are amassing before the city, and Gondor must call for aid, leading to one of this movie's greatest sequences, the lighting of the beacons. It's a scene entirely carried by the music and visuals. It's a scene that takes words and ideas from the book and utilizes them to great effect in visual form. It's a scene that embodies the entire theme of this final installment. The race of men must unite to fight the forces of evil, and across the mountains between Gondor and Rohan, the two worlds are linked. The music carries it, the visuals are incredible. It's one of the biggest fist pump moments in the movie.
The beacons are lit! Gun knuckles for aid! And Rohan will answer.
More pieces are moving. Rohan amasses their own army of horse riders. All the while, Aragorn is given the sword Anduril, forged from the shards of Narsil, the same sword that Isildur used to cut the ring from Sauron's hand. And with it, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli travel into the paths of the dead to summon an army of the dead. Yeah, we're bringing dead people into this. It's awesome. You know what else is awesome? The design of these guys. They're all skeletal and rotten, and the main guy is constantly fading between a prosthetic and a computer-generated skull underneath. It's such a cool visual, and it was a big shock to the crew when they found out that Pirates of the Caribbean did a very similar thing earlier that year. This is like that saying, you know, great minds and something or other.
The board is set. The pieces are moving.
You said it, Gandalf. The stage has been set for the ultimate final stand. All the while, Gollum's treachery is finally revealed as he leads Frodo into Shelob's lair. The creepiness and horror really comes through during this sequence, from the set design to the music and, of course, to Shelob herself. I'm not particularly arachnophobic, but when this spider's crawling around making those unearthly sounds, that's creepy, that's scary, and it results in one of the most tense sequences of the entire movie. And it ultimately leads
ADD, how are you?
where Sam returns, coming to Frodo.
Very not bad. Yeah, that's how I think about all my work.
Yeah.
It's very not bad.
GMG, take out that spider.
This is where we're at right now.
Really, really well.
So we are just putting in the finishing touches.
Masses of armies at every turn. Like
How are you, Didi?
armies of
Mega Doodoo?
finally assembled, and they begin to ride out towards.
This really isn't
Even
kind
though
of doing it
it's set up to not
justice.
merely
The
be
camera.
enough to face off the armies of Mordor, this shot is still super impressive until you suddenly realize why
Like,
they won't be able to stand against.
This just looks like mud
As we
on the camera that I'm
massive
seeing,
orc
but
armor
there's like
barrel
lots of little lines.
Morgul. Already there looks like there's a lot of them, but that's only the beginning. Because we leave this scene for about 20 minutes and then
You know, like this
and
is
we see
what
the
it's
army
actually
is
like,
still coming out of Minas Morgul. Like, how many of these guys?
and that's what the camera's turning it into.
Hundreds of thousands of them, all gearing up for the assault on Minas Tirith. And here the final battle begins, the ultimate fight for the fate of Middle-earth.
Duty Mega Doodoo. I don't really sell my work.
And yet continues to use all of
But,
the same tricks to make this equally as exciting.
I don't know. Do you, like what do you think would be like a good asking price for something like this?
Pendulum swings. And these pendulum swings are absolutely.
What would be a good market price?
Shifts of power are felt at every turn, as each side pushes the other back, trying their best to gain territory and defeat their enemy. At first, the orcs have the upper hand, launching rocks at the city, but once Gandalf takes control of Gondor's armies, they turn the tide, with trebuchets launching debris right back into the orc army. But it's not enough, as the orcs begin storming the city, breaking over the wall. That and the ring wraiths, led by the Witch King, fashioned with a stick-looking helmet, are storming the city from above. But the Gondorian soldiers and Gandalf are able to hold them back, at least for now, because the orcs have brought in Grond, a massive wolf-like battering ram to bust down the gates of Minas Tirith. And by nightfall, Grond is in position and finally bursts through the gate. Ground is being lost on the side of Gondor, as they're all forced to retreat to the second level of the city, as the ground level is suddenly overrun. And by the time the sun comes back up in the morning, the orcs have swarmed even farther, barreling through Gondorian soldiers at every turn. That is, until In a moment that brought cheers to theaters across the world, the riders of Rohan have finally arrived. The two worlds of men are united at last, as Theoden psychs up his army, literally chanting the word death, as they know this will likely be their end. And with a massive charge of the Rohirrim, they manage to turn the tide against the orcs, blasting through the army without remorse. The music, the visuals, the performances, everything comes together to make this one of the most fist-pump-worthy moments in the entire trilogy. It just makes you want to stand up and salute to Rohan. It's so good. But the pendulum isn't done swinging just yet, as even though Rohan has turned the tide is about to turn right back. That's right, the Oliphants are here, commanded by the ruthless Haradrim. Once again, scale is a huge factor here as they immediately begin to wipe the floor with Rohan's forces. I mean, these things are huge. The horses are tiny specks compared to them. It's no match, and the battle begins to turn ill once again. The forces of Rohan are nearly spent, which is made even worse when the Witch King storms onto the scene, dealing a massive blow against Theoden, which ultimately results in his death. At the same time, Gandalf and Pippin are trapped in one of the higher levels of Minas Tirith, as the orc army has nearly barreled all the way to the top. And even though Éowyn stands between the Witch King and Theoden, it's clear she's no match. And worse yet, another of Sauron's armies has arrived, this time in Corsair ships. But actually, it's not the Corsairs. The ships have been taken over by Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Now, you might be thinking, how can these guys turn the tide of battle? There's only 3 of them. Well... in one final pendulum swing, the dead army swarms over the battlefield. Legolas and Gimli continue their rivalry, counting their kills, but Legolas definitely wins this time, and he's showing off as he does it. In a massive moment, Legolas climbs onto the back of an elephant, takes out tons of Haradrim on top, all before cutting this entire carriage off the top. And then, in one final move, he shoots the elephant in the head. And
yeah, so tell me, Didi, how much do you think this would sell for in the market?
That little look Legolas gives at the end proves one simple thing. He knew exactly what he was doing.
I still only counts as one!
And at the same time, Éowyn takes her final stand against the Witch King, who declares that no man can kill him. But with the help of Merry, Éowyn winds up throwing that right back in his face.
I am no man.
It's a hugely satisfying moment. The Witch King is defeated. The dead army rush through Minas Tirith, successfully destroying the orcs, leaving the battle victorious. It's massive, it's exciting, there are so many moving pieces, and yet every part of this battle is clear and concise, as well as being visually super impressive. The visual effects, coupled with all of the set design and practical armor, it all comes together for one of the biggest visual spectacles ever put on screen. And thanks to those pendulum swings, it's successfully becomes a massive roller coaster of emotions, one that ultimately ends in relief. But the journey isn't quite over yet. There's one last leg to go, as Frodo and Sam, having escaped the clutches of the orcs and taken on their armor for disguise, have finally made it to Mordor. And just outside, Aragorn, Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, and Pippin have amassed the last of Gondor and Rohan's forces at the Black Gate, all in a ploy to distract Sauron to give Frodo and Sam an avenue to reach Mount Doom. This is the final leg of the journey. This is the final stand. The people of Middle-earth have no idea if they're going to survive. In fact, judging by the size of Sauron's army, they probably won't.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?
I could do that.
All the while, inching closer and closer to Mount Doom, Frodo is seen literally crawling up the mountain, the weight of the ring taking its toll. It's one of the best little moments because it shows that despite this momentous task, Frodo is still determined to see it through to the end. And the music sells it as well. It's not a big heroic track. It's a variation on the theme of the Shire, these light flutes that carry out the innocence of hobbits even in Frodo and Sam's most desperate hour. And it also gives Sam one final opportunity opportunity to show off just how awesome he is, because when Frodo's energy is spent, when he can't take one more step, Sam takes on the entire burden and carries him to Mount Doom.
I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you.
This entire finale is rife with emotion. It's so heavily charged through the music, the visuals. Every single part of this trilogy has led to this moment. And even back at the Black Gate, audiences would find themselves cheering at two simple words.
For Frodo.
It's a sequence that, cheesy as it may be to say it, shows off the true power of cinema. To transport people into another world and get them completely invested in the characters. This moment exemplifies that above all others, as audiences were just like Merry and Pippin, charging right after Aragorn into the final battle. And after another confrontation with Gollum, Frodo and Sam finally enter Mount Doom. This is it. This is what we've all been waiting for. It's time for Frodo to drop the ring into the lava and end this quest once and for all. But the ring is powerful. The ring is all-encompassing, and right at the last moment, it finally breaks Frodo.
The ring is mine.
He puts on the ring, alerting Sauron to his presence. The battle outside begins to go south. Aragorn can't hold off against a massive troll, and Legolas is unable to save him. Things get worse inside when Gollum appears and bites off Frodo's finger. With every moment, there's a new turn. Audiences had no idea what was going to happen next, and the tension was higher than ever. But the feeling of relief from Gollum was unmatched. The ring he had lost for so many years was finally back in his possession. And here comes perhaps one of the most significant changes from the book. Because after the moment Gollum gets the ring, the book sees him dance his heart away. He's got the precious, he's gotten all he wants, and in his celebration, he slips off the side and plummets into the lava. Now, to the filmmakers, this wasn't exactly the most satisfying way to play the ending. It made Frodo too much of a passenger in the final moment. So instead, as Gollum dances his heart out, Frodo stands up and battles him one last time for the ring, until, in their struggle, they both fall off the side. Now, let me just pause for 1 second, because I really like the editing of this scene. There's a specific way it's put together that maximizes the tension.
Oh, what are you going to draw next? I'm not sure.
Lava.
But answer my question, DD Megadoodle.
Instead, we cut back to Frodo.
Like, how much do you think this would sell for?
To grab him.
What do you think the market rate would be for something like this?
Suddenly glowing a bright red, but it still doesn't sink in. We cut back to Frodo, still hanging off the edge. He can't grab hold of Sam's arm because his hand is too bloody. Instead, you just see this look in his eye. He's so unbelievably tired, and he knows that there's an easy way out. If he lets go, it all ends here. But Sam pleads for him not to. He shouts out at him to grab on. The emotional charge here is unmatched, as the audience also desperately wants Frodo to grab hold. Until finally, with one final act of courage, Frodo finds the strength and grabs onto Sam's arm. Bloody hand be damned. And then, and only then, does the ring finally sink into the lava. Which leads into what is perhaps the most satisfying 2 minutes in film history, as the entire army of Mordor crumbles away as the power of the ring completely vanishes. Not only that, but Sauron atop the Tower of Barad-dûr falls as well. The entire tower crumbles into pieces, collapsing more and more before erupting in one of the most satisfying explosions of all time. This massive wave of relief washes over the audience. The ring has finally been destroyed. Sauron has finally been defeated. Each member of the Fellowship celebrates as Frodo and Sam swiftly escape Mount Doom as
God, Tywin Lannister is finishing and he's
complete. The mission succeeded.
Fishing and he's caught Smeagol? That's interesting.
30 minutes to go.
But answer my question, DD Megadoodle.
A journey this dense can't simply be wrapped up in a 2-minute epilogue. Instead, the movie takes its time to to tie up all loose ends, to give every character a satisfying conclusion. And it's a 30-minute ending that brings out the waterworks, as one by one we say goodbye to the characters and locations that we've been following for all 3 movies. The Fellowship reunites at last, Aragorn is crowned King of Gondor, uniting the forces of men and taking Middle-earth into its 4th age. And on top of that, Aragorn and Arwen finally reunite, getting back together after this entire journey. But where this scene particularly hits hard is when the 4 hobbits bow before Aragorn.
You can't hear me over the video? That's so weird. You usually do hear me over the video. Can you hear me now? Can you hear? Mic levels are good. What the? Anyway, Didi, I'm asking you. What do you think the market rate would be for this? What do you think something like this could sell for?
You bow to no one.
I mean, every character a satisfying conclusion, and it's a 30-minute ending that brings out the waterworks, as one by one we say goodbye to the characters and locations that we've been following for all 3 movies. The Fellowship reunites at last, Aragorn is crowned King of Gondor, uniting the forces of men and taking Middle-earth into its 4th age. And on top of that, Aragorn and Arwen finally reunite, getting back together after this entire journey. But where this scene particularly hits hard is when the 4 hobbits bow before Aragorn, but he does not accept, instead saying,
You bow to no one.
I mean, it just hits so hard, man. Everyone is bowing for them. These 4 little hobbits, they changed the world. I'm not crying, you're crying. And then the 4 hobbits return home, back to the lush green countryside of the Shire. Much like the adventure of Bilbo Baggins before them, they had gone there and back again. But even then, while the Shire remains completely the same as how they left it, these 4 hobbits have been irreversibly changed because of the journey that they have taken. It's one of the best little moments in the finale, as they all share knowing looks with each other. This is a shared experience, one only they will be able to fully comprehend, and it's an experience that has changed them immensely. Frodo especially, because even though Sam finally gets together with Rosie Cotton, Frodo feels that he can't go back to the way things were. So, after writing his own story in Bilbo's book, he decides to join Bilbo at the Grey Havens and leave Middle-earth. And here come the waterworks again, as Merry, Pippin, and especially Sam all pay their incredibly emotional goodbyes to Frodo. The music hits incredibly hard, the performances are top-notch, and it no doubt left everyone in the theater a blubbering mess. But with a knowing smile from Frodo, he sails away into the Undying Lands, leaving Middle-earth forever. And Sam returns home.
Like, you can just give me an estimate, man.
His kids, as the movie closes out on the exact line that closed out the books.
I'm back.
And with the closing of Sam's door, we finally say goodbye to Middle-earth. Alright, hold on, give me a sec. I gotta recuperate after all of that. That was huge. And audiences felt the same wave of emotions as the credits began to roll. Set to Into the West, performed by Annie Lennox. On top of that, the credits this time were different from the first 2 movies. Where the first 2 movies simply featured white text on a black background, this movie uses tons and tons of drawings by Alan Lee and John Howe to bring the whole trilogy back to the 2 people who inspired so much of the look of these movies. They even did special portraits of each of the lead actors, giving them all a proper send-off for this emotionally charged and deeply thrilling conclusion. And finally, the last drawing scene as the credits come to a close is a drawing of the One Ring, as we fade out on this massive story one last time. Critical reception to Return of the King was perhaps the best it had been for the entire trilogy. Audiences and critics alike were swept up in this massive journey and felt the emotional wallop of this movie's conclusion. That, and audiences could now view this entire trilogy as one massive entity. The story had been told. The years of effort that had been poured in was now out there for the world to see, and audiences could only come away with one conclusion. This was perhaps the most successful blockbuster undertaking of all all time. Due to the sheer size of the production, it's amazing it didn't fall off the rails. It's amazing that the whole thing kept on track from start to finish. And as a result, Return of the King rounded out what many would describe as the greatest film trilogy of all time. The characters, the story, the world, it all worked together to transport audiences into an adventure they had never seen before. And boy, were they eating it up, because once again surpassing the box office hauls of the previous two, Return of the King stormed across the box office with a whopping $377 million domestically and an absolutely astounding $1.1 billion worldwide. That's right, billion with a B. The world of Middle-earth had swept up audiences the world over as a fantasy story that could appeal to anyone at any time. But it wasn't just the box office that was heaping praise onto this third installment, because award season came around once again in the early months of 2004. Where, following suit on the previous two movies, Return of the King was nominated for a grand total of 11 Academy Awards. But getting nominated is one thing. Even though the last two movies had received their fair share of Oscar nominations, they didn't win them all. But this time, Return of the King would have a slightly different fate. Across the entire ceremony, the film was awarded Best Visual Effects for Jim Rigel, Joe Letteri, Randall William Cook, and Alex Funke, Best Sound Mixing for Christopher Boyes, Michael Semenick, Michael Hedges, and Hammond Peake. Best Original Song for Fran Walsh, Howard Shore, and Annie Lennox. Best Original Score for Howard Shore. Best Makeup for Richard Taylor and Peter King. Best Film Editing for Jamie Selkirk. Best Costume Design for Nyla Dixon and Richard Taylor. Best Art Direction for Grant Major, Dan Henna, and Alan Lee. Best Adapted Screenplay for Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Peter Jackson. Best Director for Peter Jackson. And finally, the biggest award of the night, presented by Steven Spielberg, Best Picture.
It's a clean sweep. The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, Barry M. Osborne, Peter Jackson, and Fran Walsh producers.
Return of the King broke records, holding the single biggest clean sweep in film history. 11 nominations, 11 wins. It was and still is unprecedented. And the entire crew was ecstatic. Their hard work had paid off. They had worked tirelessly for nearly a decade to bring these stories to the screen. And they had come through to win every Academy Award they were nominated for. And while these awards may technically be for Return of the King alone, because of the concurrent production and continuous effort on all three films, these awards could also be recognized as achievements for the entire trilogy. But even after the show, Oscar night wasn't quite over yet. While there is often an after party with all of the celebrities, the cast and crew of Return of the King decided to skip out on that to instead go to a fan party run by the website theonering.net. With all of the Oscars in hand, the crew decided to celebrate with the fans who helped carry these films to fruition. It wasn't just the film's awards, it was theirs as well. And after a huge night, after a celebration that the cast and crew would remember forever, after all of their hard work had paid off, after the industry and fans at large had awarded them the highest honors for the creation of this trilogy, the book was finally closed on The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, okay, here we go, and roll camera. And action! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Actually, the journey wasn't over just yet. In fact, even after the Oscars, some of the crew reunited for one final shot to complete the extended edition DVD.
We've already won the Academy Award for this film. We don't need to get all kind of funny about it, do we?
The crew just didn't want to leave Middle-earth, and thankfully for them, the extended cut of Return of the King gave them all one last chance to spend time in this universe. But even that journey must come to an end, as on December 14th, 2004, nearly an entire year after the theatrical release, the Return of the King Extended Edition was finally released on DVD. This time with nearly an hour of additional footage, including, right up top, the infamous final confrontation with Saruman. The full dialogue scene that had been so much trouble was now finally available to watch for all, and it manages to bring a nice sense of closure to an aspect that was otherwise left open in the theatrical theatrical version, as this scene brings about the death of Saruman and the death of Grima Wormtongue. From here, the movie continues to expand with more fun moments like a drink-off with Legolas and Gimli, which even features a small Howard Shore cameo, which is fun. The action sequences are given some extra moments of flair and violence. A lot of conversations have been expanded or added in. Aragorn and Éowyn share another conversation, as do Éowyn and Merry on the way to Minas Tirith. There's more time spent admiring the glory of Minas Tirith, as well as some additional story regarding the white tree that lies at the center of the courtyard. The paths of the dead are greatly expanded, as we see the long journey Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli take to reach the army of the dead. And we also see the army make their decision. We see them join forces with our heroes before they arrive in Pelennor Fields. There's also a bit of an expansion into the Corsair ships and the crew that mans them, a crew made up of cameos of a lot of the people who worked on the movie, including Gino Acevedo, Richard Taylor, Andrew Lesney, Rick Porras, and of course, Peter Jackson. While you can see them briefly in the theatrical version, the extended cut greatly expands on this scene, showing their cameos in their full glory.
Mind your aim.
But the most significant additions come after the Battle of Pelennor Fields and before the final stand at the Black Gate. There's a whole sequence where, after defeating the Witch King, Éowyn is deathly injured and is needed to be cured of whatever effects the Witch King's death had on her, which also features a song sung by none other than Liv Tyler. It's a song that was initially set to feature in the theatrical version during the scene where Arwen sees a vision of Aragorn and their son, but it ultimately didn't fit. So instead, when the time came for the extended edition, the song was brought back to kind of tie Arwen and Éowyn together, as Éowyn fully recovers after the battle, which also leads to a larger hint towards Faramir and Éowyn getting together, uniting the peoples of Gondor and Rohan. Meanwhile, on their way to Mordor, Frodo and Sam are caught in a pack of orcs, and while their armor disguises them, they still have to find a way out of this pack in order to make their way to Mount Doom. And of course, outside of the Black Gate, there's a pretty big scene where Aragorn, Gandalf, and the others come across the mouth of Sauron. This creepy and eerie character with an unnaturally large mouth. The prosthetics are fantastic, and the visual effects used to enhance it are also fantastic. But most significantly, what this scene adds is the fact that after the encounter with Shelob, Sauron got his hands on the mithril worn by Frodo, which tells the others that Frodo's mission has failed. They now believe that Frodo is dead, and that the ring is on its way to Sauron. It's a moment that adds an even bigger emotional punch to the line,
For Frodo.
as these characters know for a fact that they will not survive, and yet they continue to fight regardless. And then it adds even more when the ring is finally destroyed, and they all collectively realize that Frodo is alive and that his mission is complete. Ultimately, the movie concludes the same way, still with the 30 minutes of resolution, and right at the very end, like the first two, the credits transition to a list of all of the fan club members who helped make these movies a reality. It's a big final thank you to the fans who were supportive of these movies from start to finish. Like the previous two, the extended edition of Return of the King adds a great deal to the story, and once again, it allows you to spend just that much more time in this universe and with these characters. Where the theatrical versions are a constant sprint to get from one place to the next, the extended trilogy plays more like a marathon, and by the end, you yourself have gone through the same emotionally overwhelming journey as the heroes, which helps make the ring's destruction at the end all the more satisfying. And with Return of the King's extended release, audiences and fans now had the entire complete trilogy at their disposal, the entire journey in the palm of their hands. A trilogy that would go down in history. It was the first time 3 movies had been shot at the same time, the first time something this massive had been filmed entirely in New Zealand, and the first time the entirety of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was adapted to the big screen. I say that a little liberally, considering how much these movies wound up cutting out or changing, but that does inadvertently make this one of 2 distinct versions of this story. You have J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings in written form, and now there's Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, the big screen adaptation. The Lord of the Rings trilogy is truly a spectacle to behold. Every single aspect of the production, from the scripting to the design to the visual effects, music, and sound design, everything all comes together to form a cinematic experience unlike anything else. It's a trilogy trilogy that utilized all of the best tools that had been perfected over the last 100 years, and also created and evolved tons of new tools, helping to push the world of film into the digital age. And now, even 20 years on, the stories of this world are still sweeping us away at every turn. Because of the timelessness of the story, Lord of the Rings will always persist. New generations will always be able to get involved in the story of Frodo, Sam, and the One Ring to rule them all. It's a testament to the whole team that the trilogy came together this well. The entire crew was dedicated from start to finish, and it's felt on every inch of the screen. While some of those immense details aren't seen in the films themselves, the massively expansive appendices would go a long way to show off the immense work that went into making these movies a reality. A massive 6-disc, 20-hour behind-the-scenes documentary that was instrumental for me in getting this video made. There's so much in there. There's a reason it's considered the gold standard of behind-the-scenes documentaries. And despite how in-depth I went with this video, there's still so much more in there that I could not possibly have the time to dive into. So I definitely recommend checking those out if you haven't. But this is it. This is the end of my journey with The Lord of the Rings. And before I go, I want to thank you for taking the journey with me, for watching this entire video all the way to the end. But while I might be finished with The Lord of the Rings, I'm not quite done in Middle-earth, because next weekend, if all goes to plan, I will be back with an all-new retrospective on the Hobbit trilogy. So stay tuned for that. Until then, however, this will be the end of this video, and I will see you guys later. Disclaimer. This video contains spoilers for the Hobbit film trilogy, both theatrical and extended editions. There are time codes in the description if you want to jump around. We all on the same page? Alright, now let's go on an adventure. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. And it was a hobbit hole expertly brought to life by a team of New Zealand filmmakers for what many consider to be the greatest film trilogy of all time, The Lord of the Rings. It was a film trilogy of such renown and such excitement that after the release of Return of the King, all audiences could ask for was more. Bring more of Tolkien's world to the big screen. The question was, which story? Well, the answer was rather obvious. Despite the depth and vividness of all of Tolkien's work, there was really only one story that had to be told next. Nearly 20 years before he published The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien told the story of Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit who had no interest in going on adventures. That was until he was swept off by the wizard Gandalf and 13 dwarves to take on a quest to reclaim a lost dwarven kingdom and slay a dragon. Written primarily as a story for children, The Hobbit was a massive success. The story of Bilbo, the whimsical nature of this world, as well as the deeper themes of friendship and the nature of greed, made this into a book that would be read for generations to come. While it would ultimately only be a stepping stone for Tolkien's larger world, the story of Bilbo was able to capture the hearts and minds of kids everywhere. The story was even told as an animated television special by Rankin Bass in 1977. And now, with the Lord of the Rings movies having swept up the worldwide box office, it was proven that the world of Tolkien could be brought to live action, that these incredible worlds, characters, and stories could be brought to the big screen in incredible ways. And with so much fan demand to adapt The Hobbit to a big screen adventure in much the same way, the wheels inevitably began to turn. Turn straight over a cliff, because things did not get off to a good start. 2 years after the release of Return of the King, after talks had already begun regarding The Hobbit, some complications began to arise. For one thing, New Line Cinema, the studio behind the Lord of the Rings movies, didn't actually own the rights to distribute The Hobbit. Those rights were held by MGM. As such, the two studios wound up striking a deal to work together to bring The Hobbit to fruition. But that was merely a prelude to what comes next, because in March of 2005, Peter Jackson filed a lawsuit against New Line Cinema because he did not get the promised revenue from ancillary material related to Fellowship of the Ring. This included merchandise, video games, home video sales, anything that was attached to his first movie. But despite the severity a term like lawsuit has, Peter Jackson didn't think it was anything all that serious. He just wanted to know for sure whether or not he'd gotten the money that was promised, and felt that despite all of this, he'd still get the chance to make The Hobbit with New Line. But that same confidence was not felt on the other side of the coin, because in the year 2007, Robert Shea, one of the CEOs of New Line, said that Peter Jackson would never
that's the gargoyle guy. That's true.
Harsh words, and even harsher sentiment. After
And
lucrative
Didi, you have to answer me. You have to answer me. You have to tell me how much you think something like this would sell for.
with an all-new group of
You have to tell me.
fans everywhere felt that
Just give me an estimate, man.
signed a death certificate for the Hobbit movie. Getting rid of Peter Jackson, the voice that made those previous movies so good? Yeah, good luck. It seemed that because of this falling out, The Hobbit was dead in the water. And even if a version did come through, there was no way it'd be nearly as good as what came before. But a light began to shine at the end of the tunnel, because unlike the Lord of the Rings trilogy, New Line Cinema wasn't the only voice at the table. MGM was part of the discussion this time, and they wanted Peter Jackson. Add on to that the fact that a lot of New Line's recent
This piece of art you see before you.
Suddenly their negotiating position was beginning to falter. They did not have the same kind of financial influence that they had with the Lord of the Rings movies. They were, in fact, actively sinking. And because of this downturn in studio profits, the tide swiftly turned. Robert Shea wound up changing his mind, and suddenly New Line and MGM were able to reach an agreement. And together, in December of 2007, the two studios announced that Peter Jackson would executive produce a live-action adaptation of The Hobbit. It was finally going to happen. The machine was finally going to start rolling. After several years away, Middle-earth was going to return to the big screen for another breathtaking journey. This is where it all began. This is where a group of New Zealand filmmakers would reunite to begin an all-new journey. To see Bilbo Baggins off on his journey towards the Lonely Mountain to face off the dragon Smaug. This is where we begin The Hobbit, a complete retrospective. If you're enjoying the video, like and subscribe. It helps out a lot. Alright, let's keep it moving. With their feet on the ground and the tide beginning to turn, there was only one question left to ask. Who was going to direct? Despite Peter Jackson's continued involvement, he had no intention of returning to the director's chair. Instead, he'd produce the film, and he'd once again co-write the script with Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, just like they had done on Lord of the Rings. This new story was going to take on an all-new visual style, an all-new look to differentiate it from the previous movies. And over time, there was really only one filmmaker who could take on this task, and that was Guillermo del Toro. With movies like Pan's Labyrinth, Hellboy, and others, Guillermo del Toro shared a lot of Peter Jackson's love of practical effects, miniatures, and
It can sell for $100? Alright.
an entirely different way of approaching them. He was the perfect choice to take on The Hobbit, and in April of 2008, he was officially announced to be taking the director's chair, something that he was enormously excited about. There would still be a little studio shenanigans.
I just wanted your opinion.
However, as due to New Line's continued financial distress, they wound up being folded.
Now I'm gonna try something that might ruin this piece. Wish me luck.
Anymore, at least not to the same extent, which meant that there were now 3 major studios in charge of this project instead of the single studio on Lord of the Rings. Regardless, development and pre-production was now underway for 2 movies. That's right. I said 2. The first of these 2 movies would tell the story of The Hobbit in its entirety, chronicling Bilbo's complete adventure in one go, while the second film would become a bridge between this and The Lord of the Rings, all in an effort to transition between Del Toro's Middle-earth and Peter Jackson's Middle-earth. But over time, this idea kind of fell to the wayside. After tons of communication with fans and after much pondering, the 2-film plan shifted. Instead of making a bridge film to connect the 2 stories, the filmmakers would simply tell the story of Bilbo across 2 movies. Because despite the small scale of the story, it is a fairly complicated book to adapt, perhaps even harder in some respects than Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is more or less designed to be
If you sell out, you get to raise the price, though.
Each chapter chronicling a
I'm talking about the original. I'm not talking about
larger
Prince.
quest towards the Lonely Mountain. In this chapter, Bilbo and the dwarves face off against
I'm gonna try not to.
In this chapter, they encounter an army of goblins and their king. This chapter sees Bilbo play a game of riddles with the creature Gollum. And this chapter sees Bilbo meet with the dragon Smaug, where he has an intense conversation that changes the course of the story going forward. Because of how the book is structured, telling it all in one movie would make it feel like you were watching it at 2 times speed. So instead, the book would be split into 2 movies, to spend the proper amount of time with each of these episodes, as the crew would call them. The first movie would see Bilbo meeting the dwarves, the beginning of his adventure, the riddles in the dark with Gollum, all the way until a climactic sequence where Bilbo would save the dwarves from the elves by sneaking them away in barrels.
Alright, let's try to be fearless.
Moment where Bilbo proves his worth to the dwarves, and especially their leader Thorin, in a big way. Then, the second film would see the dwarves finally arrive at the Lonely Mountain, leading to the pivotal conversation between Bilbo and Smaug, all the way until the climactic battle of the 5 armies to close things out with a bang. The outline of the story was in place, the pieces were now beginning to move. Pre-production would now flourish over the next 2 years, and it would also bring back tons of the most pivotal players from Lord of the Rings. John Howe and Alan Lee would return as concept designers, sketching out the many locations and designs as they had done on Lord of the Rings. Richard Taylor and Weta Workshop would return to bring forth tons and tons of practical elements just as they had done before. And Weta Digital was brought back as well, with tons of the same artists and supervisors who had now known this world backwards and forwards. And this team would work day in and day out to plan these movies to the letter, all the way through to the year 2010. But even after 2 years of development, there was a fairly significant issue looming over the entire production. The movie hadn't actually been greenlit yet. It had been announced, but there was nothing actually official despite all of the pre-production.
Okay, the die is cast.
The fact of the matter was, MGM
Let's see if we F it up.
Corrupt. It was a massive tide shift in the industry, and one that many insiders were keeping their eyes on. But because of it, The Hobbit could not really move forward beyond pre-production until something was sorted out. Despite that, creatures, sequences, sets, everything was being prepared so that when the trigger was eventually pulled, the crew would be ready to get started. And actually, they even had someone in mind to play the titular Hobbit himself. In fact, Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens had only one person in mind since the release of The Two Towers back in 2002, and that was Martin Freeman. With starring roles in the UK version of The Office, as well as movies like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the writers and Guillermo del Toro agreed that he would be the perfect Bilbo. But even though they made attempts to get him to sign on, there was a fairly significant scheduling conflict, as the planned production of The Hobbit was going to intersect right with the filming of the next season of Sherlock, and that production wasn't moving. As much as the crew for The Hobbit wanted Martin Freeman as their Bilbo, they weren't sure if it was going to be possible, and decided to open up their field of view to see who else was out there, who else would take on this role. But the looming delays and MGM bankruptcy were still hanging over the production like a shadow, and the further things went along, the more tenuous things became, until eventually the production got hit with its biggest speed bump yet. In May of 2010, Guillermo del Toro announced that he was stepping away. He was no longer going to direct. Plenty of theories sprung up regarding why exactly this was happening. Some theorized it had to do with the continuing delays and lack of green light. Others could theorize that there were genuine creative differences, and that meant he essentially got forced out. The details will likely never be known in full, but either way, Guillermo del Toro was gutted that he had to step away. Which left the incredibly important question: who was going to take over? There was really only one option: Peter Jackson. But even still, he was reluctant to take over, waffling for many weeks about whether he would ultimately step back into Middle-earth. But the choice of whether or not to direct wasn't the only thing weighing on Peter Jackson's mind, because as these discussions were ongoing during the summer of 2010, there was also a very significant industry dispute happening in New Zealand, a dispute that started with
I'm trying to relax.
productions, but would eventually hit The Hobbit right on the head. In short, the New Zealand Actors Equity, or NZAE, wanted more residual pay for the actors taking part in The Hobbit. They essentially wanted more benefits for any New Zealand-based actors to really help boost the industry and give these workers a voice in New Zealand. But over the summer, talks between the NZAE and the production did not go very well, and eventually a do not work order was issued by the Screen Actors Guild. They were playing hardball, restricting any of their members from working on The Hobbit under punishment of expulsion. So Warner Brothers, the studio now behind The Hobbit, played hardball right back, because in response they essentially said, fine, we'll take The Hobbit somewhere else. Despite how big of a deal Lord of the Rings was to New Zealand, The Hobbit could be taken to a whole other part of the world, which would cost New Zealand millions of dollars. Whether or not this was a genuine idea or just a negotiation tactic is unknown. Regardless, protests erupted in October 2010. The people of New Zealand wanted The Hobbit to stay, and this led to talks between Warner Brothers and the New Zealand government to work something out. And what happened next would impact the New Zealand film industry for years to come, because Warner Brothers did eventually agree to keep The Hobbit in New Zealand, but in return, the New Zealand government introduced new legislation that would come to be known as the Hobbit Law. This law essentially tore down the organized unions and instead placed the responsibility of fighting for workers' rights in the hands of the individual. The problem is that the reason these things organize in the first place is because the collective voice is significantly louder than a whole bunch of individual voices. And because of that, the pleas by the NZAE were completely disregarded as their voice has seemingly been
relax harder.
It's an incredibly massive blow to New Zealand's film industry, especially for the smaller local productions.
Yes, that's really helping, dude.
Productions, though, those would actually spend more time in New Zealand because things had just gotten a whole lot cheaper. And the impacts of this entire dispute are still being felt in New Zealand to this day. Now, despite that massive news cycle, there was still a lot of general excitement for these Hobbit films, especially once October 16th rolled around, because it was finally confirmed that Peter Jackson would in fact return to direct The Hobbit. 10 years after The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson was back in Middle-earth to tell Bilbo's story. But this also came with a bit of a problem, because despite so much work already having gone into Guillermo del Toro's vision of the movies, all of those designs were very much entrenched in his DNA, not Peter Jackson's. Peter Jackson felt that if he continued with these designs, he'd be doing an imitation of Guillermo del Toro, an imitation that would honor neither filmmaker. So instead, the pre-production process essentially started over from scratch. Everything would be completely redesigned and remade with Peter Jackson. Now, that makes a fair amount of sense. The only thing was, the start of production wasn't gonna move. They were gonna meet their start time come hell or high water, which meant that Peter Jackson had to design both movies in a fraction of the time that one would want. In the Lord of the Rings days, Peter Jackson had 2 or 3 years to prep for those movies before they rolled a single camera, and Del Toro also had 2 years for The Hobbit. But with the start of production set for February 2011, Peter Jackson now only had 5 months to prep both of these movies. All hands had to be on deck. Everyone needed to be working full steam ahead. There wasn't going to be any taking pictures with racks of props that were done a year before the start of production. This was going to be a full-on sprint to put everything in place. On the bright side, though, the movie was now green-lit. Ain't that a weight off the crew's shoulders? And as such, both movies were officially announced to audiences. While they kind of already knew that this was going to happen, it was still exciting to finally get confirmed release dates. Part 1 of The Hobbit would release in December of 2012, and Part 2 would release a year later.
Okay, not so bad.
2013. 2015. Now, with a deadline in place and fast approaching, the crew worked tirelessly to create all of the creatures, models, sets, anything they'd need for the start of production. This also included nailing down the actor for Bilbo Baggins. While Martin Freeman was still the #1 choice, the scheduling conflict with Sherlock still presented an issue. But the bigger issue was that during the casting process to find a new Bilbo, there was no one that could live up to Martin Freeman. There was no one that could embody the character that well. So, in a rather drastic move, Peter Jackson did a major schedule shift, moving around the major pieces of production to allow Martin Freeman to work on The Hobbit, then leave for 3 months for Sherlock, and then come back to finish The Hobbit. It was a massive vote of confidence, and with the schedule change laid in place, the news was made official. Martin Freeman was going to play Bilbo Baggins. All they needed now...
Oh, what? Oh my god. I think I just got a huge raid. Who raided me?
The location used in The Lord of the Rings...
Holy crap.
Other than Hobbiton. A nice green countryside...
Alright, let me see what's going on. I'm getting like 5,000 raids, 5,000 follow requests. But it's not telling me... Wait, what? Oh no, this is some sort of a bot. This is some bot business going on. What the hell? What is going on? What the shit is happening? What is going on? Why did I just get followed by like 1 million bots? What is going on? Why have 6? Is this gonna get me in trouble?
DD_mega_dada_ says not like this, 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 not like this.
What is this? What is going on? Why did 400 bots just follow me? What is... What just happened? Maybe clip that? Clip that so I have some evidence that I didn't do this. I just got...
_mega_dada_ says fucking botters not like this.
I didn't do this. I just got 500 followers. I didn't do this. How do I complain to Twitch about this? I mean, as nice as it looks over there that says I have 592 followers, I would like to do something about this. Hold up, let me Google this.
holes. Although the hobbit holes weren't there anymore. They all had to be torn down after The Lord of the Rings was done. But now, with the Hobbit underway, the crew got permission from the owner of the land to rebuild Hobbiton, this time with permanent materials. That's right, not only would Hobbiton be remade for this new movie, but it would also become a permanent tourist site. People had already come from far and wide to see where things used to be, but now they could see Hobbiton in its full glory for years to come. But even with a lot of the same crew and even some of the same locations being used from The Lord of the Rings, there were a few key differences, specifically with the advancements of technology that the crew was
Hold on, let me see.
For one thing, in the wake of the immense success of Avatar, The Hobbit was going to follow suit and film and release both Hobbit films in 3D. Not only that, but the two films were going to be shot in 48 frames per second as opposed to the traditional 24 frames per second. What this meant was that the cameras were going to be capturing twice the amount of images in a second to create
I found a link
when it came to CG animation. Now, the consequence of doing this is that plenty of the world-renowned tricks used on Lord of the Rings were now unusable. Forced perspective.
I didn't do this, man.
Because the 3D would immediately give away the effect, and the 48 frames per second made miniatures.
Why was I chosen by these bot followers?
Which meant the crew this time is going to be relying a lot more on visual effects to create the
okay, so
for the
people
story.
apparently
Still, a lot of these locations would be designed on Howe and Alan.
People
voices were used to great effect on Lord of the Rings, and they'd also
Twitch
have
support
designing one of the most
on Twitter
aspects of this movie, one of the most challenging
So
aspects
I guess
of the
I'll
story that the
treat them.
filmmakers had to overcome. Because once you say you're going to adapt The Hobbit, fans everywhere become excited to see one thing above all others, and that is the dragon. Smaug is one of the most important characters to the story, and dragons have been incredibly popular across centuries of stories and tales. And since Tolkien's dragon was one of the most popular dragons of all time, the expectations for Smaug were through the roof.
You know, so you're actually finding yourself making a movie where there's this huge excitement about this dragon, and then that's, you know, the good part. The bad part is we have to deliver.
And so the team got to work. Tons of Weta Workshop artists got together to begin presenting a crazy variety
Sorry,
of
I'm
designs
looking
and
into it.
ideas for Smaug, all to find the perfect dragon that would be used in the movie. But Smaug was not the only daunting task in front of the filmmakers, because there's another extremely difficult aspect to adapting The Hobbit, and that is the dwarves. Now, it's not because they're exceedingly difficult characters to conceptualize or adapt, it's more the fact that there's 13 of them. That's a lot of characters, but the filmmakers decided that they were in fact going to use all 13 in the movie. Now, to bring them to life, obviously the crew looked to the dwarf they already had, Gimli in The Lord of the Rings. The only issue was if you put 13 Gimlis on screen, that ain't gonna work out super well. Each dwarf needed a personality, they needed a distinct look. They were all going to get a different hairstyle, a different wardrobe, and of course,
I'm done looking at this.
different beard. But the designs of how the dwarves were going to look was only going to take things so far. What they really needed was a group of 13 actors to flesh out the dwarves into fully living, breathing characters. So audition calls were sent out and tons of actors auditioned for a generic dwarf, just to get a read on how they'd play that type of character. And some of these actors really gave unique portrayals to this one character, giving their own feel and instincts, and through that process, the pool of actors was finally narrowed down. 13. The dwarves had now been assembled, and they were Graham McTavish as Dwalin, Ken Stott as Balin, Adam Brown as Ori, Jed Brophy as Nori, Mark Hadlow as Dory, William Kirscher as Biffer, James Nesbitt as Bofer, Stephen Hunter as Bomber, John Callan as Oin, Peter Hambleton as Gloin, Robert Kaczynski as Feely, Aidan Turner as Keeley, and finally, the leader of the company, Richard Armitage as Thorin Oakenshield. While there might have been some concerns that Richard Armitage was too young to play the character, the filmmakers decided to portray him younger to make him a more active part of the story, as well as give the impression that once the quest was complete, Thorin would live a long life going forward. Now, with these 13 actors assembled, they were all put through an extensive dwarf boot camp. This included lots and lots of physical training to get these actors into shape to play these dwarves the best they could, including tons of fight training, horse training, as well as movement training. Dwarves move differently than men or hobbits or elves. Their center of gravity is lower, so their walking stance changes. Terry Notary was brought in as a movement choreographer to really hone in on the specific movements of these characters. At the same time, the filmmakers were also looking to beef up these actors to make them look shorter and stockier. Dwarves are about 4 feet tall, but if you shrink an average size human to that height, it just looks like you've shrunk a human. So each actor was going to wear massive boots, big fat suits, or muscle suits depending on the dwarf. Then there were the prosthetic hands, or in Dwalin's case, arms, to help beef up how big their limbs were. Each dwarf was also given a large bald cap to increase the size of their head and give them new ears. That, coupled with a forehead prosthetic and a wig for their head and face, managed to bring the entire look of these dwarves to fruition.
Oh god.
And weirdly enough, once everything was on and the actors began to walk around, they found themselves naturally walking exactly as Terry Notary had instructed. Once all that weight was added, they fully became the dwarves. There were a couple changes made to some of the dwarves, as the amount of prosthetics became detrimental to Keely, Beaufort, and Thorin. While most of the dwarves worked perfectly, the prosthetics on these dwarves were dialed back a bit. You know, these actors had these great qualities about them that were ultimately the reason they were cast, and the prosthetics were beginning to restrict that. But after some fine-tuning, a look was finalized. Overall, this entire time period of training and makeup tests managed to unite these 13 actors in much the same way the characters were united. They were a troupe, they bonded significantly. And it wasn't just them either, because not only were all 13 of these actors trained in the boot camp, but their stunt doubles went
another
training, as did
I got another 100 follows.
Even with the advancements in technology, The Hobbit was still going to use tons of scale doubles for the dwarves and Bilbo. They even brought back Kieran Shaw, who was one of the scale doubles on Lord of the Rings, often acting as Frodo's double. And now he'd act as Bilbo's double on a number of occasions, which is pretty neat. Even Martin Freeman joined in during some of the dwarf boot camp to spend time with the dwarves, allowing all of them to get a feel for each other and these characters. And now, with the dwarves assembled, the clock turned to the year 2011. Where several additions were made to the cast, including newcomers Mikhail Persbrandt as Beorn, Sylvester McCoy as Radagast the Brown, as well as some returning players from Lord of the Rings. Ian McKellen would obviously return as Gandalf the Grey, Andy Serkis was going to return as Gollum, but not just that, there were some Lord of the Rings characters set to return that were not part of the Hobbit book. As a sign of some of the expansions the crew was making to the story, Cate Blanchett was set to return as Galadriel, and Christopher Lee was going to return as Saruman. Despite the relationship ending on rocky terms with Saruman's ending cut from Return of the King, Christopher Lee was set to return to embody a wiser, uncorrupted version of Saruman, something he was incredibly excited about. And then, finally, Elijah Wood was confirmed to reprise his role as Frodo Baggins, indicating that parts of the story would take place closer to the events of Lord of the Rings, since Frodo wasn't even born yet during Bilbo's adventure. At the same time, pre-production continued in full swing leading up to the February production start.
Previewers, who's the third person? Say hi.
We're working on at this stage was including some of the more whimsical side of Tolkien's world. Considering The Hobbit is a far more light-hearted story than The Lord of the Rings, the filmmakers saw fit to include more songs to better encapsulate this tone. Perhaps the most significant song was the Song of the Misty Mountains, a rallying song for the dwarves at the beginning of the story. Taking the lyrics from the book, a group of New Zealand musicians called Plan 9 worked to create a melody that fit the tone the scene was going for. Overall, they wound up creating nearly 10 different versions of the song, all with the same lyrics, but with completely different tunes, and handed them off so the filmmakers could listen to them all and pick the perfect one. And from this, one specific version was chosen that embodied the more harrowing side of the quest, as well as gave the perfect melody for the scene, a melody that would ultimately be worked into the film score months later. But despite the machine rolling steadily at the start of the new year, the pre-production efforts would hit just
Show yourself.
a bit of a snag right at
I bet it's a bot.
Award-winning Kiwi filmmaker Sir Peter Jackson's had a health scare, and filming of The Hobbit will be delayed while he recovers from surgery for a bleeding ulcer. Sir Peter was admitted to Wellington Hospital last night after suffering from stomach pains.
Suddenly, Peter Jackson was out of commission, and filming was delayed an entire month to work around it. This was simply the latest in a long line of pre-production troubles for The Hobbit. Some even began to theorize that the production was cursed. But it wasn't just the fact that the crew was going to lose their director for 6 weeks. The delay in production also had an impact in the order they'd filmed scenes. Originally, the production was going to begin in Hobbiton, right at the end of New Zealand's summer. But with the delay, that had to be pushed all the way back to the next summer in October. But this wound up being a blessing in disguise, because now nature would have time to grow around the set and make it feel completely lived in, and not like a bunch of film crew just came in and put some holes in the ground. But this wasn't the only bright side, as at the same time, the crew now had 1 more month of pre-production time, and boy did they use it. Across the additional weeks, the crew worked tirelessly to get everything they could. They had the extra time, and they were full steam ahead. The dwarves got extra training time in, the prosthetics were able to be fine-tuned, weapons, props, creatures, all of them were able to get just a bit more time to look as good as possible. And eventually, on March 3rd, Peter Jackson was finally back, up and running again to see the last weeks of pre-production to the end.
I hope you're all happy. The things I do to get an extra few weeks of prep.
And now, in the final weeks, the pre-production efforts had gotten everything they could for the production to start rolling, which finally led to March 21st, 2011, the first day of principal photography.
One of the things we wanted to do to mark the start of shooting was to do a pōwhiri ceremony.
Pōwhiri is a traditional Māori welcoming ceremony.
It's a ceremony to welcome newcomers should they come in peace, and it was the perfect way to welcome the new and returning cast and crew to kick this project off. After all of this talk of a Hobbit curse, this put so many people at ease. All they could focus on now was making the best movie they could, because now they were about to embark on a 15-month production journey across Middle-earth. After 10 years since the last 15-month production journey, Peter Jackson and the entire crew were about to embark on a once-in-a-lifetime experience again. Just don't tell anyone that lots of very big sections of the movie hadn't been prepped at all. No, like huge sections. Most of the movie wasn't prepped, but they started filming anyway. It all started with Riddles in the Dark, perhaps one of the most iconic scenes from the book, where Bilbo played a game of riddles with none other than Gollum. Andy Serkis was brought back for this 2-week stint to bring Gollum back to life once again. And with the advancements of motion capture technology over the previous 10 years, Gollum was going to be brought forward unlike anything that had been seen before. The motion capture was done live on set at the same time as filming, as was facial performance capture. They were able to get all of the little intricate details of Andy Serkis's face, allowing Gollum to emote and move around like he had never done before. But working as Gollum wasn't the only thing Andy Serkis was going to do, because once this scene wrapped up, he'd become this movie's second unit director. While Lord of the Rings had up to 5 units at any given moment, The Hobbit would have 2 major units.
What kind of riddle is Pat? What have I got in my pocket?
Main unit and Andy Serkis were doing
yeah, I know.
Unit, all working.
I think that's the point, you know.
Goal of creating the best movie possible. And Andy Serkis's work would begin during the scenes filmed in the interior of Bag End, a far neater, more clean version of Bag End than what was seen in Lord of the Rings, because Bilbo has yet to go on his adventure. This is also where Bilbo would meet the dwarves. For the first time, all 13 dwarves were on set, acting together and bringing these characters to fruition. You know who else was in this scene? Gandalf, a character that had at least 2 feet of height on the dwarves, but without the use of forced perspective or even scale doubles in this particular scene, how are they going to convincingly make Gandalf bigger than the dwarves? Well, this time around, the crew used motion control camera rigs and 2 different sets to capture the effect. One set was much larger, built for the dwarves to walk around and seem small in, and the other was much smaller, all to make Gandalf look like a giant. The major difference, though? The bigger set set for the dwarves in Hobbit was fully dressed. It was bag-end in its entirety. Whereas the Gandalf set was a whole bunch of green. And given that Gandalf was the only character in these scenes bigger than the others, it meant that Ian McKellen was on his own, with only an earpiece to hear what the other actors were doing. But he couldn't see anyone else. He couldn't see the environment. He was alone in a green room, having to respond to things that were on another set. And this building unease wound up getting to Ian McKellen in a rather significant way.
It was so distressing and off-putting and difficult that I thought, I don't want to make this film if this is what I'm going to have to do.
MP Cartoonist
It's not what I do for a living. I act with other people. I don't act on my own.
Hello, I'm the cartoonist. How are you?
So the crew set out to make
Welcome in.
McKellen feel welcome.
We have just been invaded by
process. And
bots.
not only that, but the results were being
We just got like 500 bots following us for no reason.
bigger than the other actors in
So some weirdness might happen on
but
screen.
it was working. Despite the rather tenuous and off-putting scenario, they were getting results.
And I was made to feel, as so often happens when you're working
says I'm
with Peter
good.
Jackson and his colleagues, that you belong, and I want you to feel at ease and happy and at home.
But after the work was done in Bag End, the production hit a bit of a snag.
How am I? I'm alright.
Krasinski, who was set to play the dwarf,
Tell me about yourself. I'm the cartoonist. What do you do?
production for personal reasons, which meant that as the crew got ready to film the sequence with the 3 trolls, the casting team was in a sprint to find a new Feely, until eventually they landed on Dean O'Gorman, who had instant chemistry with Aidan Turner, which is great because the two were going to play brothers. And after a speed run of the dwarf boot camp, Dean O'Gorman was put into his costume and was able to fully embody Feely just in time for the scene. Dean O'Gorman was also a New Zealander, a Kiwi, which meant that 7 of the 13 dwarves, just over half, were native of New Zealand, which was something the crew was very proud of.
You draw.
So 3 of the 13
Send us a link.
would wind up doubling up their duties on The Hobbit, as they'd also be playing the 3 monstrous trolls, characters that were glimpsed very briefly in Lord of the Rings, but would now be seen in full for The Hobbit. Each troll was given a unique design and a unique personality, each embodied by the 3 actors. William Kersher played Tom, Mark Hadlow played Bert, and Peter Hambleton played William. Not only would they provide the voices for these characters, but they'd also provide motion capture performances to help sell exactly how these characters would move and interact with each other. Then you have the fun scenario where they would also play their dwarves in a brief fight scene against the trolls, meaning that they were in fact fighting themselves, which is quite fun. Following that, Sylvester McCoy began his work as Radagast the Brown, a character that was not in the Hobbit book, but was a part of Tolkien's larger world. And this also led to the biggest expansion in the movie's story as opposed to the book, because at a certain point in the story, Gandalf leaves the Hobbit and the dwarves to their own devices, because he's got other things to take care of. While the book never saw Gandalf's side of the story, with him only reappearing at key moments later down the line, the movies would fully explore his quest with Radagast and see what he was really.
I'm the cartoonist. Send us some links to your work. I'm gonna go make some tea.
Strict adaptation of The Hobbit to instead become more like prequels to The Lord of the Rings, which led to the production's turn to a massive set built for Dol Guldur, a huge, gothic, and frightening set that embodied all of the same terror and industrialization that was seen in the many orc sets in Lord of the Rings. So I guess with a set that embodied evil so completely, it was nice to swiftly return to one of the more glorious and peaceful locations, Rivendell. One of the many breathtaking locations seen in Lord of the Rings, and this time it was made to be even more breathtaking. You know, because of the specifics of the story, Rivendell was starting to wither away by the time of Lord of the Rings. But here it would be in its full bloom, its full glory, which also brought back a couple key actors. One of them was Bret McKenzie. He had a brief appearance in Lord of the Rings, an appearance that was more than enough for fans to latch onto. In fact, fans even gave him the name Figwit, which is an acronym for
Frodo is great, F-I-G. Who is that? Referring to Brett.
So when it came time to return to Rivendell, he was brought back for a slightly expanded role, with even more lines of dialogue and an official name. Now the character is known as Lindir. But he wasn't the only returning actor, as the scenes in Rivendell also brought back Hugo Weaving as Elrond. For once, a Lord of the Rings character was brought back who actually had a role in the Hobbit book. And it seemed he hadn't aged a day since Lord of the Rings, and was able to bring this character back in full force. But this section of filming also resulted in a temporary farewell for Martin Freeman, as the time had come for him to step away for a couple months to film Sherlock, which also resulted in the end of what the crew would call Block 1 of filming. While this would be one massive production that'd take nearly a year and a half to complete, it would be broken up into 3 chunks or blocks so that the crew could take a short rest before returning to shoot. But that didn't stop the press cycle for these Hobbit films, because during production, Peter Jackson began releasing video diaries to keep fans in the loop for what was going on. And boy, did these begin to give a wave of nostalgia for fans of the Lord of the Rings movies. Middle-earth was coming back, and it was gonna look better than ever. But then came the really exciting news. Ever since the announcement that there would be 2 Hobbit films, fans speculated endlessly about what they'd be called. The Lord of the Rings movies all had subtitles taken from their respective book, after all. It would have been a little uninteresting to just call these movies The Hobbit Part 1 and The Hobbit Part 2. So instead, on May 30th, it was announced that the 2 films would be titled The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey and The Hobbit: There and Back Again. The latter derived directly from Tolkien's own alternate title for the book. And meanwhile, even though the production was in a hiatus, some of the crew, including Peter Jackson, were still doing a little bit of filming. In fact, they were filming for the first time outside of New Zealand. Some of the crew traveled up to London to film a handful of scenes with Christopher Lee as Saruman and Ian Holm as an older Bilbo Baggins. The latter cemented the idea of a bookending framework for these movies, as they'd start and end with Ian Holm's Bilbo telling Elijah Wood's Frodo the story of his adventure, which also led to the return of Elijah Wood as Frodo to film with Ian Holm for the prologue to the first movie. And upon his return, Elijah Wood noticed a key difference in how the hobbits were brought to life this time as opposed to last time, specifically in regards to the feet. While Lord of the Rings saw each of the hobbits get their feet glued on in a process that took nearly 2 hours every day, this time the hobbits were given entire legs that would slide right on, making the application and removal of the hobbit feet so much easier.
The advances in hobbit feet, I think, are going to make certain hobbits upset.
Eventually, in August of 2011, production resumed for Block 2 of filming. But with Martin Freeman still out filming Sherlock, the production instead filmed scenes with a bunch of other characters. In fact, production spent a lot of time with new faces. It all kicked off with Luke Evans taking on the role of Bard the Bowman, as the first scenes of Block 2 saw him leap across roofs during the climactic scene where Smaug burned Lake Town. But that's not where it stopped, as production would turn to another corner of Lake Town, specifically to meet the master of Lake Town, played by Stephen Fry, and his assistant, played by Ryan Gage. While there were mentions of assistants in the book, the movie was going to bring one of them to center stage, expand their role, and give them the name Alfred. All of which served to expand on the book's thematic ideas about the corrupting nature of greed, as well as simply expand on certain aspects of Lake Town for this much bigger adaptation. Shortly after that, the production took a dive into the Woodland Realm, where they'd meet the Mirkwood Elves, a whole other group of elves separate from Rivendell or Lothlorien, a group of elves far more closed off, hidden underground. While still carrying that same elegance, they weren't quite as ethereal as some of the other elves. Once again, the production team created an all-new look for elves that, while still definitely elven, had an entirely new feel, which was also brought on by the Elven King, none other than Thranduil, played by Lee Pace. But Thranduil is not just the king of the Woodland Realm, he is also the father of Legolas, which meant that the filmmakers were going to expand this aspect even further and bring Legolas on board. Of course, that meant bringing back Orlando Bloom to take on this role, to portray a younger, more naive version of Legolas on an earlier part of his journey. Although it was worth noting by the crew that despite Lee Pace playing Legolas's father, he is actually 2 years younger than Orlando Bloom. But elves are immortal and all look the same age, so it works out ultimately. But even they would not be be the only elves, because in an effort to expand on the woodland realm as well as add another female character to the ranks, the writers wound up creating a character almost entirely from whole cloth. And this was the character of Tauriel, who would be played by Evangeline Lilly. It was a bit of a departure from the book, but since the book included no mention of female characters whatsoever, outside of maybe a one-off mention of Galadriel, it seemed the right move to add this character to continue to expand on the source material. And all of these actors would film together in the woodland realm, but they'd film scenes that weren't super planned out. The lack of pre-production time was beginning to catch up to the filmmakers. While they weren't at wit's end just yet, they were starting to make things up on the fly and create scenes with the actors that either barely existed on the page or in some cases didn't exist at all. It's probably a little stressful writing and filming scenes on the fly, but on the bright side, Martin Freeman was finally back to continue his work as Bilbo Baggins. The season of Sherlock had wrapped, and now he was available for the entire rest of the Hobbit shoot, which continued
I think I'm done with this.
forest, filming one of the scariest scenes from the book, Flies and Spiders. Continuing from the ground laid by Shelob in Lord of the Rings, the crew would draw from Peter Jackson's arachnophobia to create a truly terrifying sequence with massive spiders. And they'd also get to wrap all of the dwarves in spiderweb. They really just got to make a mess out of everyone. I bet they all had a great time. And with them wrapped in cocoons and laying on the ground, I bet some of them slept for a fair amount of those days. Following that, sequences were filmed in the Misty Mountains, seeing the more challenging
It feels done.
Bilbo and the dwarves' journey to the
Does it look done?
mountain, which also included one of the more dangerous stunts in the movie, where during a short rest inside of a mountain, the floor would suddenly break open, dropping the dwarves into Goblin Town. The entire trapdoor was built practically, and stunt performers would actually fall through. But the specifics of how they'd fall if they'd land on each other, as well as the danger of the fact that once these doors started moving, they wouldn't stop. If something went wrong, they could crush one of the performers. All of this was hanging over the crew's head for this entire scene. Intense planning was put in place to make sure that this stunt was as safe as possible. They did a slow test run just to get a feel for everything and make sure everyone was on the same page, which then all led to the moment where the stunt performers got into full costume and filmed the scene for real.
And 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5.
But it all worked out in the end. The stunt was safe, no one got hurt, and the shots worked out great.
It feels done. What do you think?
That benefited greatly from planning. And it led directly, both story-wise and filming-wise, into the sequence in Goblin Town, where the cast would also be joined by Barry Humphries as the Goblin King. He embodied a gross, massive,
I hated the Goblin King
creature, but he wasn't the only one, as there were tons of full-body goblin prosthetics for the scene, which were also equally gross and disturbing in their own way. Although that came with its own problems, as each of the goblin performers had been trained by Terry Notary to move in a certain way, to carry themselves in a specific manner to really fill out these characters. But once the costumes were on, those movements became quite restricted and even got lost at times, which led to one of the biggest turning points in the crew's approach to making these movies, and a turn that led to far more reliance on CGI, because it was decided that all of these prosthetic costumes would ultimately be replaced digitally to sell the movement that they had worked so hard to perfect. But it was still handy to have these costumes on set, both for reference for the actors and lighting reference for the visual effects work that would come later. Now, while Goblin Town was perhaps one of the more gothic and deliberately off-putting sets for the production, the crew would soon take a trip to a location that was seemingly the exact opposite, because it was finally time to return to Matamata to film the exteriors of Hobbiton. Nature had overgrown the area, giving it the perfect summer look for this part of the story. The location was living, breathing, there were tons of Hobbit extras, and it also saw the final stretch of Elijah Wood as Frodo Baggins. After saying a hearty goodbye at the end of pickups for Return of the King, this was really going to be it. But it was still a heartfult reunion, bringing back these groups of people, if only briefly, to tie things closer to the Rings, just 10 years later.
Now, I'm wondering what I'm making next.
Yes, I do. People boy.
I'm 30 now. Puts things into perspective.
Oh, God.
And it served to rather poetically end Frodo's journey in a way, whilst also kicking off Bilbo's journey, which is a whole weird reversal of how things actually played out chronologically, but what are you gonna do? And then, over the last few months of the year, the production journeyed across New Zealand, filming in many breathtaking locations. They filmed in a location literally called Paradise for the exteriors of Beorn's house, which also saw the beginning of Mikhail Persbrandt's work as Beorn himself. The rock and pillar range was used for filming the area surrounding the Lonely Mountain, and Strath Tiari was used for what would become the infamous Scene 88, a foot chase scene where the hobbits, dwarves, and Gandalf would be running away from dreaded wargs. And it became infamous because it was just a whole bunch of running shots. Every few days, Scene 88 would pop back up on the call sheet, and the actors knew they'd be running once again.
Like, yeah, but, you know, we're f***ing running around again, you know, from imaginary wargs, as opposed to real wargs, which they didn't even get those in. We had to imagine the f***ing wargs.
Meanwhile, as Block 2 was ongoing, there was one final role that got cast, perhaps one of the most integral roles in the entire movie, Smaug himself. And who was going to portray him? Well, none other than Benedict Cumberbatch. Not only did he have a working relationship with Martin Freeman on Sherlock, but he also has this voice that the filmmakers immediately got attached to. And with word of his casting rippling across the internet, fans could not be more excited. Smaug had finally found his voice. And finally, with some filming done at Lake Pukaki for the barrel sequence, filming...
Lake what? Lake what? Excuse me?
But just before the has this voice that the filmmakers immediately got attached to. And with word of his casting rippling across the internet, fans could not be more excited. Smaug had finally found his voice. And finally, with some filming done at Lake Pukaki for the barrel sequence, filming for...
That's very close to something dirty.
Break. But just before the year came to a close, the production would release something that fans had been anticipating for months now. While Peter Jackson had been releasing video diaries every few months, what fans really wanted to see was a full trailer. And they didn't have to wait all that much longer because the clock eventually turned to December 20th, 2011, where, in part to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Fellowship of the Ring, Warner Brothers, New Line, and MGM released the very first official trailer for The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. Within seconds, this trailer fully recaptures the feeling of Middle-earth. The production design, the music, all of it brought back a slew of memories from Lord of the Rings, until eventually expanding into the new territory this adventure was going to cover, as most of this trailer is backed by the song of Misty Mountains, sung by the dwarves. It manages to give this slightly eerie yet awe-inspiring sound to all of this incredible imagery, all the while giving hints and teases to Bilbo's journey, and how this one simple hobbit will go on an adventure that will change him forever, which was exemplified right at the very end with a tease to the One Ring.
Baggins, what is Baggins is precious.
And of course, Gollum was going to make a return. While this movie was still a year out, fans were incredibly excited. Middle-earth was coming back. This world was going to return to the big screen, and it looked better than ever. And excitement continued to build as the clock eventually turned to the year 2012. That's right, it was now 2012. The release of the first Hobbit movie was now less than 12 months away. Despite that, the crew still had a hell of a lot of work to do. But before Block 3 of filming could really kick off, the production spent a bit of time on a motion capture stage with Benedict Cumberbatch. They spent January working with him to craft a totally physical performance for Smaug the Dragon. And I mean physical. Benedict Cumberbatch was crawling on all fours, twisting and contorting his body. He was fully embodying this character. And while a lot of this motion capture data wouldn't actually be used for the final animation, it still served as a great animation reference to motivate how Smaug was going to act and conduct himself physically. It also just gave a whole other dimension to Cumberbatch's voice, which would also breathe life into Smaug.
Yes, you no longer matter to me.
Actually, straight into Block 3 of filming, which also included the addition of one final cast member. To the great pleasure of fans everywhere, Billy Connolly was cast as Dian Ironfoot, one of the greatest dwarven leaders who had a significant role towards the end of the Hobbit book. With his addition, every major character had been cast for the Hobbit, and things were full steam ahead for this third block. It all started with the dwarves finally reaching Erebor. They had reached the back door into the Lonely Mountain, which was not only a scene that was incredibly important to the dwarf characters, but also to their actors. They had gone on this intense journey and had finally arrived at their destination. While there was still a long road ahead, this scene came with a wave of satisfaction for everyone involved. Benedict Cumberbatch even visited the set, witnessing the dwarves finally arrive on his lair.
I'm going to see the dwarves this afternoon having another go at it with axes. What a waste of time that'll be. And Bilbo figuring it out because he's a smart ass. You can see how I empathise with my character by just dissing everyone else. Anyone would think it was all about me. It is.
Production soon turned back to Lake Town. In fact, the production turned back to Lake Town several times. With scheduling conflicts and actor availability, they wound up tearing down and rebuilding the Lake Town set 4 or 5 times across production. And this wasn't a simple set either. In fact, it was perhaps the most elaborate set in the entire production. And there were tons of great sets. The Mirkwood Forest was spooky and psychedelic. The Dol Guldur set was massive and imposing. But Lake Town, you could live in Lake Town essentially, especially when it was taken out of the soundstage and built in the back lot, allowing it to grow so much larger. The actors and crew members would later say that they could stand in certain spots and not see any green screen or sign that the set ended. It was like they were really there. There was also a ton of detail put into Bard's house, but not once. It was actually built twice at the 2 different scales. One regular size set for the elves, Bard, and his family, and a super-sized set for the dwarves. That same scale trick was used for the interior of Beorn's house. While only one set was built this time, it was the super-sized version of the set. Everything was built at nearly double scale, so everyone, including the crew, looked absolutely tiny. Then, of course, the same motion control camera tricks used for Gandalf and Bag End were also used to meld Beorn into the scenes with the dwarves. Then came one of the most significant parts of the shoot, the sequence inside Smaug's lair. Once again, the production designers were at the top of their game. The set was huge, and it was covered to the brim with coins, cups, jewelry, gems, you name it. And while it was only a small piece, it proved enough to really show how massive and expansive Smaug's lair was going to be. And this entire chunk also featured the scene between Bilbo and Smaug. Although because Benedict Cumberbatch's part was being recorded separately, and because he was working on the upcoming Star Trek sequel, Martin Freeman instead acted opposite Leith McPherson. She was already a dialect coach during the production, teaching the actors their various speech patterns, especially when it came to speaking in Tolkien's various languages. And now, to provide reference for Martin Freeman, she would...
So while they were talking about this in the video, right, I was thinking of my friend. So both... Oh, hello, Art by Ty reading. How are you? Wait, there's a Streamlabs tag in that audio. I have to change it. Hello, Art by Ty. Thank you very much for the read. Something interesting happened a little earlier, and that interesting that
Nameless user 8 says Artola Washake Artola Washake Artola Washake Artola Washake Artolo Spiderink Artolo Spiderink Artolo Spiderink Artolo Chomprol Artolo Chom